Chapter 601. The Hundred Saints Alliance was located at the center of the central main sword domain and the center of the entire ancient sword continent. It was the top existence on the ancient sword continent. The Hundred Saints Mountain was the highest mountain in the central main sword domain. It was not originally called the Hundred Saints Mountain, but changed its name because of the Hundred Saints Alliance. The main hall of the Hundred Saints Alliance was located at the peak of the Hundred Saints Mountain. However, ordinary swordsmen were not qualified to enter the main hall of the Hundred Saints Alliance. They were either experts on the level of the sword of Gojosian or swordsmen with special treatment. The examination of sword venerables was not held in the main hall of the Hundred Saints Alliance. It was only for the examination of the sword of Gojosian. If the central main sword domain was divided into the inner circle at the center, the outer circle at the edge, and the middle circle in the middle of the inner circle and the outer circle, there was a branch palace in each of the 8 directions in the middle circle. The branch palace of the Hundred Saints Alliance. The one closest to famous Sword City was the Hundred Saints Alliance's southwest branch hall. As soon as Chu Mu left famous Sword City, he flew in a straight line, cutting through the sky, and headed for the Hundred Saints Alliance's southwest branch hall. Half a month later, Chu Mu arrived at the Hundred Saints Alliance's southwest branch hall. Usually, the Hundred Saints Alliance's branch hall was very quiet. There was only one person in charge, who could be regarded as the hall master of the branch hall. For some reason, the southwest branch hall was very lively today. When Chu Mu entered the branch hall, he saw as many as 19 swordsmen. Including himself, there were 20 swordsmen. There were men and women. Some were less than 30 years old, while others were 40 or 50 years old. They all had different expressions, but the only thing in common was that they all exuded an astonishingly sharp aura. When Chu Mu appeared, everyone's gaze fell on him and swept past him. Yan Jiyo. Chu Mu swept a glance and was slightly surprised when he saw a face that he had seen before. Yan Jiyo of the underworld sword sect stood in the crowd like a crane in a flock of chickens. Waves of cold and gloomy aura emanated from his body, and the air seemed to be about to freeze. Anyone who approached him would feel as if they were about to be pulled into the underworld, beyond redemption. Underworld Sword Way. With Yan Jiyo's Mahayana sword way and his innate talent, there was no doubt that he would become the sword of Gojosian in the future. He might even have a chance to become a sword saint. Chu Mu recognized Yan Jiyo, but Yan Jiyo did not recognize Chu Mu. Therefore, he was directly ignored. The southwest sub-palace palace master was a sword of Gojosian. He wore a black robe and walked over elegantly. He glanced over and saw that among the 20 swordsmen, there were quite a few who were younger. He was a little surprised. "You're all here to participate in the sword venerable trial, right?" The southwest sub-palace lord said directly. "Sword intent of 70%, and you must not be over 50 years old. Those who do not meet these 2 requirements, please leave." No one moved. Everyone who wanted to participate in the venerable sword trial knew of these 2 requirements. If they didn't meet the requirements, it would be a wasted trip and they would lose face. No one was that stupid. There were 1 or 2 swordsmen who looked to be in their 50s, but in reality, they were not over 50 years old. "As usual, release your sword intent," the Southwest Palace Master said. Immediately, the 20 swordsmen released their sword intent one after another. Sharp and powerful, the sword intent emitted a shocking power, cutting the air around them and piercing the sky. The sub-palace lord glanced over them one by one, feeling the sword intent of each swordsman. 70%, 70%, 70%, all of them were at 70% sword intent. For these swordsmen to be able to comprehend 70% sword intent, it meant that their comprehension was very high. At the same time, they all had their own opportunities. Perhaps they had already been to the famous sword tower. The famous sword tower was not the only place that could accelerate the improvement of sword intent. In fact, there were similar sacred grounds within the top 10 sword sections. Therefore, many outstanding disciples of the top 10 sword sects did not need to go to the famous sword tower to compete. After all, the higher the level of sword intent, the smaller the benefits after entering the famous sword tower. Once the sword intent exceeded 70%, the effect of entering the famous sword tower would be minimal. For example, Yen Jiuyo had never been to the famous sword tower because he did not need it. As a highly valued disciple of the underworld sword sect, he had all the cultivation resources he needed. Therefore, Yen Jiuyo was able to have the strength to challenge a sword sovereign in just a few years after reaching the origin realm. Among this group of people, Yen Jiuyo was the focus. Withdraw your sword intent. Next is the sword sovereign test. Defeat your opponents and you will pass the test, the Southwest Palace Lord said. The sword sovereign test was similar to the sword hero test. It was difficult but also not difficult. As long as one's strength was raised to a certain level and mastered the application, they would be able to defeat their opponents and pass the test to become a sword sovereign. Follow the order, one by one, the sub-palace lord said as he shot out sword energy from his hands and opened a door in the void. The first one standing was a male swordsman in his 30s. He walked directly into the door and disappeared as if he was swallowed. After about a quarter of an hour, the male swordsman walked out of the light door. His eyes were shining and his aura was fierce. Obviously, he had just experienced a great battle. Then, a ray of light appeared on the sword sovereign's sword steel. It shone out and quickly retracted, forming a line of words. Zhao Xingting, Raging Thunder Sword Sovereign. The Southwest Palace Lord did not say anything and signaled the second swordsman to enter. This time, in less than a quarter of an hour, this swordsman also came out. His aura was also fluctuating, as if he had just experienced a great battle. A line of words appeared on the sword sovereign's sword steel. His name and the corresponding title of sword sovereign. The title of sword sovereign could be changed, but there was only one chance. For example, Chu Mu's title was Zhen Tian Sword Hero when he was a sword hero. However, if he passed the sword sovereign test, he could change his title and continue to use the title of Zhen Tian. Most swordsmen would not change their titles. Only when there were some changes would they change their titles. For example, after becoming a sword hero and obtaining a sword Dao inheritance, then after becoming a sword sovereign, they might use the sword Dao inheritance as their title. However, every title was unique. In other words, once someone had used a title, no one else could use it unless that person died. The third swordsman entered. This swordsman took a full quarter of an hour and several dozen breaths to come out. He looked a little embarrassed, but he still passed the test and became a sword sovereign. Fourth, fifth, sixth Yen Jiuyo was the seventh to enter. Soon, after about 60 breaths of time, Yen Jiuyo reappeared. Other than the aura around him becoming colder, no one could tell that he had gone through any battle. Yen Jiuyo, Sword Sovereign Nether Spring. This line of words appeared on the Sword Sovereign's sword steel. Not bad, not bad. The Southwest Palace Lord, who had been silent all this time, suddenly nodded and said. The swordsmen who had already passed the assessment looked at Yen Jiuyo in shock. Only they knew how difficult the assessment was. Yen Jiuyo had actually passed it so quickly. His strength was truly astonishing, far surpassing theirs. Yen Jiuyo stood to the side with an indifferent face, without any expression. The 8th swordsman entered. The 9th swordsman entered, time passed, and the 19th swordsman also entered. So far, other than Yen Jiuyo, who had only used 60 breaths of time to pass the test, the other swordsmen had used at least half a quarter of an hour. After some time, the 19th swordsman also appeared and used nearly a quarter of an hour to pass the test. The length of the test showed the strength of an individual. So far, Yen Jiuyo's strength was the strongest, far surpassing that of the other swordsmen. Chu Mu was the last to enter. In this regard, no one thought that Chu Mu could surpass Yen Jiuyo. The reason why they had not left yet was because the Southwest Palace Lord had not yet issued the sword token that symbolized the status of sword sovereign to them. They could only continue to wait for Chu Mu to finish the test and issue it together. Walking into the door of light, time and space alternated and Chu Mu appeared in a small world. He couldn't see the sky or the ground. Only white clouds floated around him. Immediately after, a figure seemed to gradually condense out of nothingness. It was a swordsman who looked somewhat similar to Chu Mu, but also somewhat similar to any other swordsman that Chu Mu had seen before. He was Chu Mu's opponent. As soon as his opponent appeared, a sharp sword intent gushed out from his body, piercing through the clouds and shattering them. 70% sword intent. Tyrannical sword energy also surged in the surroundings at the same time. Peak of the complete origin realm. In an instant, his opponent attacked. In just the blink of an eye, his opponent had consecutively slashed out over 100 times. Every single slash formed a sword light that contained powerful sword origin, sharp and fierce sword intent, as well as the wind and fire profundities. Numerous cyan flames converged into a flaming storm that rumbled and swept through the heavens and the earth. Its might was astonishing and endless. The fire borrowed the power of the wind, and the wind aided the fire. The fusion of the profound of wind and the profound of fire greatly increased the power of this sword skill, making it extremely terrifying. Chu Mu could feel that his profound of wind and fire had both reached 40%. His opponent for the test was a standard sword venerable. In other words, the sword venerable level that was recognized by the 100 Saints Alliance must be at the peak of the completion of the astral realm, 70% sword intent, and at least 40% dual profound fusion to display the power of the sword technique. The strength of a sword venerable that was recognized by other places was more or less different. The cyan firestorm was extremely terrifying as it swept towards Chu Mu. All the clouds in the surroundings were shattered and turned into nothingness. Chu Mu could feel the scorching heat and sharp cutting power from the cyan flames. This was a true sword venerable. Without dodging or retreating, Chu Mu's eyes reflected the cyan firestorm. In the depths of his pupils, traces of dark gold appeared and disappeared. In the next moment, Chu Mu pulled out his sword. The 10-meter-long dark gold crescent moon seemed to be made of dark gold metal. It was covered with mysterious and complete patterns as it tore through the sky. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 602. In the blink of an eye, 40 breaths of time had passed. Chu Mu's figure flickered as he walked out of the light door. Even Yen Jiryo had a stunned and dazed look on his face. The Southwestern Palace Master stared at Chu Mu in a daze, thinking that he was hallucinating. Chu Mu's body did not have the slightest fluctuation of a sharp aura. It was the same as before. It was as if he had entered to sightsee and not to fight. Yen Jiryo stared at Chu Mu, his pupils shrinking to the size of needles. The cold aura on his body fluctuated more and more, and the surrounding air began to turn cold. Traces of fighting spirit radiated from his body. The difference between 15 minutes and 60 breaths was obvious, and the difference between 60 breaths and 40 breaths was equally obvious. What did this mean? It meant that the other party had killed his opponent with a single strike, while Yen Jiryo had dodged his opponent's attack before counterattacking. Moreover, it had taken him 3 strikes to kill his opponent. It had taken him even more time. The Southwestern Palace Master finally came to his senses. Good, good, good. The 3 words in a row reflected his surging emotions. He could not hide the smile on his face at all. As for the other swordsmen, their gazes towards Chu Mu were full of reverence. In their hearts, Chu Mu's originally insignificant status had suddenly risen to a level where they had to pay great attention to him. They definitely could not offend him. He looked so young, at most 30 years old, but he actually had such strength. It was really too terrifying. At this time, Chu Mu's name appeared on the Sword Sovereign's sword steel, followed by the title of Sword Sovereign Zhentian. Chu Mu. Yan Zhuyo's pupils dilated and contracted as he stared at the name on the sword steel. An astonishing light shone from his eyes, like a sword light that could pierce through everything. Others might have forgotten this name, but Yan Zhuyo had a deep impression of it, because this name was engraved on his soul like a brand. Originally, the Heavenly Sword hero ranking was just a competition between him and Zhu Wudao. It was difficult to determine who was better. Who would have thought that Zhong Qingtian would appear and push them all down? But there was a limit to Zhong Qingtian's strength. After that, he was surpassed by them. At this time, another person appeared and surpassed all of them in one fell swoop. Number 1 on the Heavenly Sword hero roll, the name that had suppressed him, Zhong Qingtian and Zhu Wudao, and was unable to make a comeback in the end, was Chu Mu. Yan Zhuyo only knew this name, but he had never seen Chu Mu before. He had always had one thought in his mind, and that was to find Chu Mu and fight him. However, the central main sword domain was vast and there were countless swordsmen. Finding a swordsman was like finding a needle in a haystack. It was extremely difficult. Who would have thought that he would actually meet Chu Mu during the sword venerable assessment? In fact, he wasn't the only one. Zhong Qingtian and Zhu Wudao had also been thinking about Chu Mu, but just like him, they couldn't find him. Chu Mu, fight me. Yan Zhuyo turned around and a sharp light shot out of his eyes, piercing through the void and shooting straight at Chu Mu. The cold aura around him instantly intensified, as if he had fallen into the yellow springs of the 9 hells. Yan Zhuyo's fighting spirit was monstrous and shocking. The other swordsmen couldn't withstand it at all and had to retreat. Only Chu Mu allowed the fighting spirit and the cold aura to attack him without moving an inch. Everything seemed to disappear, and only Chu Mu and Yan Zhuyo were left facing each other. The surroundings seemed to have become the water of the yellow springs of the 9 hells, flowing endlessly. Stop! An unexpected voice seemed to fall from the sky and instantly disintegrated Yan Zhuyo's cold and sharp aura. It was the Southwest Palace Master. With a wave of his hand, 20 venerable sword tokens flew out and landed in the hands of each swordsman. Chu Mu could feel that the illusory fortune in his body had increased a little. If you want to fight, you will have plenty of opportunities. The Southwest Palace Master swept his gaze over Chu Mu and Yan Zhuyo and said with his hands behind his back, "In a little more than a year, there will be an excellent opportunity." What opportunity? Yan Zhuyo looked at the Southwest Palace Master and asked coldly. The Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly. The Southwest Palace Master said with a smile on his face. The Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly? Chu Mu and the others were puzzled as they looked at the Southwest Palace Master. I won't go into the details. You just need to remember that the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly will be held in a year and 4 months. If you want to participate in the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly, you'd better get to the 100 Saints Mountain before then. The Southwest Palace Master said, when the time comes, almost all the sword venerables of the ancient sword continent will be present to compete. All the sword venerables of the ancient sword continent. Everyone's emotions surged. The ancient sword continent was very vast and no one knew how many sword venerables there were. If the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly could gather most of the sword venerables and compete, it would definitely be an unparalleled event. It was believed that no sword venerable would be willing to miss such an event. Think about it, at that time they would be able to meet many experts and see all kinds of sword Dao. They would be able to fight with many experts and constantly improve their strength. Yan Zhuyo was tempted and so was Chu Mu. Suddenly, Chu Mu remembered what Su Haosha said to him when he left the sacred wild city. Maybe we will meet again in 3 years. At that time, there might be a battle between you and me. These words vaguely rang in his ears again. I see, Su Haosha already knew about the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly and will also be there. It seems that only sword venerables are qualified to know about this event. Chu Mu thought in his heart and suddenly understood. However, what puzzled him was that, according to the records, the ancient sword continent had never held such an event. It could be said that this unparalleled sword venerable assembly was the first. Why was it not held in the past, but now? Chu Mu didn't know, but perhaps there was a special reason. After thinking about it, Chu Mu felt that this had nothing to do with him. Everyone was not a fool and would definitely have such doubts. If it was some kind of conspiracy, someone would see through it and stop it. After all, the 100 Saints Alliance had 100 sword saints. They were not to be trifled with. Moreover, the unparalleled sword venerable assembly was a grand event organized by the 100 Saints Alliance. There is still 1 year left. There are more than 4 months left. I will go into closed-door training for 1 year and then rush to the 100 Saints Mountain. Chu Mu thought to himself and turned to leave the 100 Saints Alliance's southwest sub-palace. Seeing Chu Mu leave, Yanjiu also quickly stepped out of the southwest sub-palace. The other swordsmen also left one after another. Wait. Outside the southwest sub-palace, Chu Mu had just soared into the air when Yanjiu's voice sounded. He also soared into the air and chased after Chu Mu. Chu Mu, fight with me. This was Yanjiu's wish, and also his obsession. Why not wait until the unparalleled sword venerable assembly? Chu Mu turned around and said indifferently. We will wait until the unparalleled sword venerable assembly, Yanjiu said. Yanjiu said. He pulled out his sword and a cold and sharp aura surged. Like a surging tide, the waves charged towards Chu Mu. Behind Yanjiu, a yellow river vaguely appeared. It was cold and sinister, as if there were countless dead souls howling in pain and countless white bones floating up and down. Sword Dao manifestation. The other swordsmen were shocked when they saw this. Oh, this boy has actually mastered the Yellow Spring Sword Dao to such an extent. Sword Dao manifestation. Although he is just a beginner at such a young age, it is enough to show that his talent is extraordinary. The southwest sub-palace hall master stood at the entrance and exclaimed. Sword Dao manifestation was the sign of a level after inheriting a certain Sword Dao. Only when one's comprehension of the Sword Dao had reached a certain level would they be able to achieve Sword Dao manifestation. It also meant that the swordsman had truly entered the threshold of the Sword Dao. Many swordsmen were unable to achieve Sword Dao manifestation even after inheriting the Sword Dao. Yanjiu had achieved it at such a young age. No wonder the southwest sub-palace hall master was shocked. Chu Mu's expression was solemn. Sword Dao manifestation had brought him a kind of pressure. Take this! Yanjiu shouted and swung his sword. The yellow spring water behind him flowed faster, as if it had merged into the sword, and rushed toward Chu Mu. Moon severing. With a shout in his heart, Chu Mu drew his sword and slashed out. The metallic dark golden crescent moon cut through the air and slashed at the yellow spring water. With a splash, the yellow spring water drowned the dark golden crescent moon, but the dark golden crescent moon broke through the yellow spring water and tore it apart as it continued to attack Yanjiu. The yellow spring's water contained a terrifying power, causing the dark golden waning moon's power to be constantly depleted as it grew smaller and smaller. When it reached Yanjiu, it was easily shattered by Yanjiu's sword. The yellow spring's water also lost its power under the shredding of the dark golden waning moon, unable to cause any damage to Chu Mu. This time, I will only use this sword. Yanjiu sheathed his sword. Unparalleled sword venerable assembly, I hope you won't disappoint me. Saying so, Yanjiu turned around and flew in the other direction. What a powerful Sword Dao! Looking at Yanjiu's back, Chu Mu secretly said. It was said that the true power of the Sword Dao could only be displayed when the Sword Dao manifested. Before that, the power of the Sword Dao wasn't particularly strong. Chu Mu knew that Yanjiu hadn't used his true strength in that sword attack just now. Similarly, Chu Mu also hadn't used his true strength. Moon severing was just the weakest move among all his sword skills. That sword attack was just a test from Yen Jiryo against Chu Mu. Unparalleled sword, venerable assembly, let's fight again. Chu Mu muttered to himself, turned around and flew away quickly. I must participate in the unparalleled sword, venerable assembly, the other swordsmen secretly said as they clenched their fists to express their determination. However, when they thought of Chu Mu and Yen Jiryo, they felt discouraged. It seemed that there was no comparison. However, there was still more than a year left. Maybe in the next year or so they would be able to advance by leaps and bounds. The central main sword domain was full of opportunities and fortuitous encounters. The unparalleled sword venerable assembly was destined to attract the attention of countless sword venerables and make their hearts beat faster. Everything would be revealed 1 year and 4 months later. Who would be unparalleled in the world? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 603. Ordinary swordsmen did not know about the unparalleled sword venerable assembly. Only those who had become a sword venerable were qualified to know about it, or those who had surpassed the level of a sword venerable. There were many sword venerables in the ancient sword continent. After they learned about the unparalleled sword venerable assembly, most of the sword venerables began to go into seclusion. A small number of sword venerables went into some dangerous and forbidden places to explore, to see if they could come across any fortuitous encounters or obtain inheritances to improve their strength, in order to amaze the world at the unparalleled sword venerable assembly. Chu Mu flew all the way. He did not belong to any sect, so he had to rely on himself to find a suitable place for seclusion. After spending about a few days, Chu Mu found a place that he was satisfied with for seclusion. There was a cliff on a high mountain that was about a few hundred square meters in size. There was an ancient pine tree on the edge of the cliff that extended diagonally out of the cliff, standing in the wind. The cliff reminded Chu Mu of the time when he was cultivating in the Qinfeng sword sect. The pine cliff was very similar, but the cliff here was wider than the one on Mount Qinglan. It was also more secluded and uninhabited. Chu Mu made some slight modifications and carved a cave residence on the cliff for him to live in. Below the cliff was a vast sea of clouds that stretched as far as the eye could see. Chu Mu stood at the edge of the cliff, facing the sea of clouds. There was a setting sun, and the afterglow of the setting sun shone on the boundless sea of clouds. A blood-red color permeated the air, as if it was stained with blood. There was a bit of beauty and a bit of tragedy. Unknowingly, Chu Mu fell into memories, recalling the short period of time when he was cultivating in Mount Qinglan. When he woke up, it was already the next day. The sun rose, and the golden-red light shone on the boundless sea of clouds, adding a bit of sacred solemnity to the air. The sun rose and set, and the sun rose and set. It was a cycle, and yet another day had passed. Chu Mu unsheathed his sword and began to practice his basic sword technique on the cliff. Unknowingly, Chu Mu had integrated the sword technique he had seen in the Myriad Origin Palace into his basic sword technique. In an instant, his basic sword technique became incomparably sharp. Every sword strike was simple and direct, capable of tearing through space and containing an incomparably terrifying power. It could be said that every stroke of the sword contained the power of the sword principal realm, and its power was even more terrifying. Now that the basic swordsmanship had been upgraded, the power of every stroke was comparable to a slightly weaker sword skill. Once Chu Mu got close and performed this powerful basic swordsmanship, it was equivalent to being continuously attacked by sword skills. After practicing the basic sword techniques for the entire morning, Chu Mu sat at the edge of the cliff and looked at the sea of clouds. His mind gradually calmed down, and he got rid of all distracting thoughts, entering a state of emptiness. Slowly closing his eyes, Chu Mu began to comprehend the sword intent. Day after day, month after month, Chu Mu settled down on this mountain. Every day, he practiced the infinite desolate sword codex, the heaven-seizing technique, the basic sword technique, comprehending the sword intent, comprehending various profoundness, researching sword skills, and reading analysis of spatial force. In the blink of an eye, half a year had passed. Chu Mu's overall strength had clearly increased again. However, without a suitable opponent, he didn't know what level his strength had reached. Ever since he had obtained the heaven-seizing technique on the 4th level of the ancient sword tomb, Chu Mu had begun to cultivate. However, the progress was very small, and there weren't any result. It wasn't until he had killed the 100 swift dragon sword guards and plundered their cultivation talent that Chu Mu felt that the heaven-seizing technique had made significant progress. However, there was still some distance before he could break through. Today, when Chu Mu wasn't cultivating, he tidied up his interspatial ring. He discovered that the stellar heavenly crystal he had obtained from the ancient desolate realm had been completely used up. As for the unknown wild beast's eggshell, there were traces of cloud patterns that looked like wings. It's mutated. Chu Mu revealed a smile. At this moment, the egg in his hand suddenly trembled as if it had come to life. With a cracking sound, a crack appeared on the eggshell. Chu Mu had already placed the eggshell on the ground. He had been staring at it, waiting for the little life inside to break out. With another cracking sound, the eggshell broke and a head popped out. For the first time, it breathed in the air of this world. Chu Mu was a little curious as he stared at the little life that was about to break out of the eggshell. The head was about the size of a duck's egg, and the neck was thicker than the head. It was similar to a miniature version of the savage clawed dragon's head, and its color was a light yellowish-brown. The cracking sounds continued as the little life's 4 limbs also broke out of the eggshell, displaying extraordinary strength. When other little life forms first broke out of their eggshells, they would often be very clumsy as they struggled to get out of the eggshell. However, this little fellow was very domineering. It used its strength and 4 limbs to forcefully destroy the eggshell. As soon as it was born, a powerful aura emanated from its small body. This little fellow's body looked very strange. It had the sharp and terrifying claws of a savage clawed dragon, and its hind limbs were developed like a savage clawed dragon. Its body was strong, and it vaguely had the violent and domineering strength of a savage clawed dragon. In addition, it also had a tail that was longer than its body. The end of the tail was incomparably sharp, as if it contained a wisp of cold star. There was a small bulge on its forehead, and there was a small bulge on the left and right sides of its back. It was unknown what they were. This little fellow's skin was yellowish-brown, and upon closer inspection, it looked very delicate. As everyone knew, when little life forms first broke out of their eggshells, they would treat the first life form they saw as their closest companion. This little fellow was no exception. This little fellow took steady steps towards Chu Mu, and stretched out its pink tongue to lick Chu Mu's palm. Its teeth were very thin and very dense. Chu Mu used his other hand to touch the little fellow's body. Its delicate skin felt smooth and warm. He did not dare to use too much strength, for fear of abrasions. Vaguely, Chu Mu could feel that this little fellow was extraordinary, but as for how extraordinary, he was not sure. He only knew that this little fellow's bloodline had undergone many mutations. 3 times? 4 times? Or even more. He did not know, but one thing was certain. Once this little fellow grew up, its strength would definitely be extraordinary. After being intimate with Chu Mu for a while, the little fellow turned around and walked towards the shattered eggshells on the ground. It opened its mouth and used its tongue to roll the eggshells into its mouth. Its fine teeth began to chewing the eggshells and swallowing them. After a while, all the eggshells were eaten by the little fellow. The little fellow even used its claws to rub its belly and burp. Chu Mu was suddenly surprised. The savage beasts he had encountered did not possess much intelligence, but the little fellow in front of him behaved very humanely. Could it be that this little fellow also possessed intelligence? The savage beast's strength was astonishing. Once they possessed intelligence, they would definitely become even more powerful. This discovery made Chu Mu even happier. After eating, the little fellow walked to Chu Mu's side and leaned against Chu Mu's leg to lie down comfortably. Looking like a young master, Chu Mu did not know whether to laugh or cry. It could be expected that with this little fellow, Chu Mu's life would definitely be much more interesting. Looking at the sleeping little fellow, Chu Mu muttered to himself, "I don't know what kind of savage beasts this little fellow is. Its bloodline has mutated so many times. Let me give it a name. Although it is small now, once it grows up, it will definitely be powerful and absolutely domineering. Let's just call it Bawang. Bawang. Bawang." After repeating it several times, Chu Mu immediately clapped his hands and decided, "Little fellow, from now on, your name will be Bawang." Whether this name was vulgar or not, Chu Mu did not care. Naming was originally a difficult task. Even Chu Mu was no exception. As expected of a savage beasts that had mutated so many times, Bawang's growth speed was very fast. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. Bawang, which had originally been the size of a puppy, had already grown to the size of an adult dog. Its fine teeth were even more obvious, and its biting strength was astonishing. With a simple swipe of its claws, it could leave clear marks on the hard mountain walls. When he had left the ancient savage realm, Chu Mu had killed 100 savage swift dragon sword guards and stored their corpses in his spatial bracelet. The meat had been preserved very well and had become Bawang's food. Eating the meat of the savage beasts, the energy contained within was constantly absorbed by Bawang, accelerating its growth. As for the inner cores of the savage beasts, the energy contained within them was too great. For the time being, Bawang could not eat them. In the second month, Bawang's body had grown to the size of a wolf dog, and it was still eating the savage swift dragon's meat. In the third month, Bawang's body had grown to the size of a calf, and it was still eating the savage swift dragon's meat. However, its appetite was growing, and the remaining savage swift dragon's meat was not enough to support its appetite for the next month. It should be time to eat the inner cores of the savage beast. After Bawang had finished eating all the savage swift dragon's meat, Chu Mu picked out the inner core with the weakest energy and gave it to Bawang. After eating the inner core, Bawang fell into a deep sleep. It only woke up 10 days later. Its body had grown even larger, and it was now the size of a bull. After waking up, it ate another inner core. This time, after sleeping for 5 days, its body had grown even larger. In addition to cultivating, Chu Mu also had an additional mission, which was to fight Bawang. The current Bawang only had the strength of a steel-crushing savage beast, but its bloodline had undergone many mutations. In addition to its innate combat talent and high intelligence, as well as Chu Mu's deliberate training, it was completely comparable to an earth-shattering savage beast. Chu Mu discovered that in a situation where their strength was about the same, it was quite difficult for him to defeat Bawang with just his combat skills. This also meant that Bawang's combat ability had reached a certain level, surpassing many swordsmen. However, Bawang still had a lot of potential that could be developed further. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 604. The sun was shining brightly, and the wind was gentle. In the small forest, when the wind blew, the branches swayed and the leaves rustled. It was full of rhythm. Walking in the forest would make one feel peaceful and happy. A few swordsmen were either carrying swords. They were talking and laughing as they walked on the forest path. They were swordsmen who had just returned from training and were preparing to return. Suddenly, the ground trembled slightly. Wave after wave surged like a tide, which surprised the swordsman. "What's going on? It seems like something huge is approaching." "It's here." The swordsman immediately looked in front of them and saw a huge figure leaping into their vision. It was quickly approaching. "What is that?" The swordsmen were shocked. Their eyes were wide open as they stared at the huge figure that was rapidly approaching. They felt a shadow looming over their hearts. The powerful aura made the air in front of them difficult to breathe. It was almost suffocating. They wanted to pull out their swords, but they felt that their bodies were not listening to them. They felt weak and powerless. If they did not clench their teeth and force themselves to hold on, they would have fallen to the ground. The huge figure flew past them without any intention of paying attention to them. When the huge figure disappeared from their sight, the swordsmen let out a sigh of relief and fell to the ground, unable to support themselves. So scary, scared me to death. I thought I was going to die this time. It's too powerful. Just the aura alone is unbearable. Did you see that? On the back of that thing there's someone. What? How is that possible? There's someone. I saw it too. Such a terrifying monster. If no one tamed it, how could it appear here? And once it appears, do you think we can survive? With that said, everyone came to a realization. Just the aura alone was enough to make them unable to move. If it wanted to kill them, it would be easy. However, such a terrifying monster actually ignored them. It was obviously tamed. They thought about how powerful it must be to be able to tame such a terrifying monster. The figure was like the wind as it flew past. The ground trembled slightly, which was caused by the feet of the huge beast. Because the steps and frequency of the feet were quite consistent, the ground trembled with a rhythm. This was a huge wild beast that was about 5 meters tall from its feet to its head. Its whole body was pale gold. It was formed by fine scales, which reflected a bright luster under the sunlight. Its front claws were curled, and it was hard to imagine how sharp they would be when they were open. Its 2 hind legs were very developed and powerful. It ran very fast and very stable. The people on its back did not feel any bumps at all. The bumps on his forehead and the 2 on his back were getting bigger and bigger, as if something was about to pop out. His tail, which was longer than his body, kept swaying as he ran, undulating up and down like waves. Savage behemoth with multiple blood mutations, overlord. As for the person on its back, it was naturally Chu Mu. After cultivating on that nameless mountain for more than a year, Chu Mu's sword intent had increased to 72%. His tearing profound and illusory profound had both increased to 72%. His water profound and fire profound had also increased to 73%. His space profound had increased to 43%. In addition to the perfection of his sword skills and the study of analysis of the power of space, Chu Mu's overall strength had increased by a lot. As for Bawang, after using the earth-shattering wild beast's inner core many times, it continued to improve. Now, it was at the peak of the earth-shattering wild beast's level. However, its strength and speed exceeded that of ordinary earth-shattering wild beasts. The layer of fine pale gold scales on its body had a strong defensive ability that was comparable to the barbarian Ankylosaurus. With near-human intelligence, innate fighting instincts, and the fighting skills that Chu Mu had deliberately trained, Bawang now had the strength to kill ordinary mountain-shattering wild beasts. It could even fight against star-shattering wild beasts. In other words, Bawang now had the strength of a powerful sword venerable. Unfortunately, Bawang couldn't fly, and Chu Mu couldn't put it into the space ring. He could only ride Bawang to the center of the central main sword domain, 100 Saints Mountain. Fortunately, there was enough time. Even if they couldn't fly, Chu Mu didn't care. Sitting on Bawang's back was very stable. In addition, Bawang's strength was amazing. Chu Mu could completely rest at ease and meditate. Originally, Bawang could have been faster. However, Chu Mu considered that too fast would affect the left and right sides, causing unnecessary pressure damage. Therefore, he had Bawang reduce its speed by about 50%. This speed was faster than the flying speed of a peak Origin Realm swordsman. Although he had never been to 100 Saints Mountain before, with the guidance of the map, he wouldn't get lost. The path that Chu Mu chose was more remote, such as mountains, rivers, and forests. It was to avoid unnecessary panic when he entered a crowded area. Not long after, Bawang ran to a river. It wasn't very big, only a few 100 meters wide. Bawang didn't reduce its speed and directly rushed over. As it approached the river, it exerted a little force and suddenly leaped up. It drew an arc and landed steadily on the other side of the river. With a bang, the ground shook. Bawang's feet left 2 deep footprints on the ground. The edges of the footprints were filled with cracks. He took a step forward and started running again. Bawang was like a gust of wind. In this place where there was no one, his speed kept increasing. In the sky, a figure was flying rapidly. Suddenly, he was alarmed by the movement below and quickly lowered his altitude to take a look. "That's a barbaric giant beast." The swordsman was stunned and said, "Is it a barbaric clawed dragon?" "No, a barbaric velociraptor?" "That's not right either. It's not a barbaric ankylosaurus or a barbaric tyrannosaurus either. If it's neither, why does it have their aura? Could it be multiple bloodline mutations?" The swordsman was excited as his eyes lit up. He had once trained in the ancient wild region, so he knew how difficult it was for a barbaric giant beast to mutate its bloodline, let alone multiple times. Is it a triple or quadruple mutation? And its tail? The more he looked, the more excited he got. A single mutated barbaric giant beast wasn't enough to excite him. A double mutated barbaric giant beast was enough to excite him, not to mention a triple or quadruple mutated barbaric giant beast. The more mutated a barbaric giant beast's bloodline was, the more powerful it would be, and the more terrifying its combat ability would be. In the past, I always wanted a barbaric giant beast with multiple mutated bloodline as a mount. Unfortunately, I never had the chance to find one. I didn't expect that after more than 10 years, my chance would come. With a cold laugh, the swordsman in the sky suddenly dove down like a falling meteor. He drew his sword and slashed out. With a boom, a huge sword light fell like a meteor and blasted towards Chu Mu. When the swordsman was descending, Chu Mu had already noticed him. At that time, the swordsman didn't show any hostility, but Chu Mu still paid attention to him. The swordsman indeed didn't have good intentions. He used a sword skill and a killer move right off the bat. A strong aura locked onto Chu Mu, trying to kill him in one strike. He drew his sword and unleashed Moon Slash. The Moon Slash, formed by the fusion of 72% laceration profound and mountain-shaking energy, was extremely powerful. The dark golden crescent moon slashed upwards, and the meteor fell and collided. With a boom, a terrifying explosion sounded, and a strong impact spread out like fireworks in the sky. Die! The swordsman couldn't see, but his spiritual power locked onto Chu Mu's figure, and he attacked again. Strangely, Chu Mu's figure disappeared and reappeared behind the swordsman, slashing out with his sword. Iron Slash. Unparalleled power. Once hit, death would be certain. However, when the sword slashed out, it was only an afterimage. The real body appeared a few meters away. He turned around and slashed, and the violent sword chi was like a meteor that filled the sky, smashing towards Chu Mu. Chu Mu's figure disappeared again. The two sides fought back and forth, exchanging dozens of blows. Their figures changed strangely, and not a single sword hit the other party. Explode! 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 The swordsman suddenly roared. Sword rays exploded like meteors, rumbling and covering a radius of several thousand meters. In the endless energy shock wave, a deep purple aurora shot out. The swordsman in the sky was shocked and instinctively raised his sword. With a bang, the sword flew out of his hand, and the tyrannical power made his body fly into the sky. His chest felt tight and it was very uncomfortable. The swordsman made a prompt decision and flew higher. I will take my sword and your life. That savage behemoth with multiple bloodline mutations is also mine. The swordsman's speed was extremely fast, and he seemed to have used a secret technique to increase his speed. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared, and there was no way to catch up. However, his words also let Chu Mu know why he attacked Chu Mu. It was for Bawang, the savage beast with multiple bloodline mutations. It seems that he is also a sword venerable going to the 100 Saints Mountain to participate in the unparalleled sword venerable gathering. I will take your sword first, and I will take your life later. Chu Mu secretly said, and put the sword into his spatial ring. This was also a top king grade sword, and it was not inferior to Chu Mu's 8-sided sky desolation sword. Such a sword was very valuable, and there were not many of them. The swordsman should feel the pain of losing this sword. He landed on Bawang's back again, and they continued on their way. This was destined to be a grand event. Sword venerable level swordsmen from the ancient sword continents north, south, east, and west sword domains, and even the outer sword domains, all came, either alone or in group. Most of them flew and gathered from all directions. Every sword venerable's heart was burning, and they were full of anticipation to fight with other sword venerables. Think about it, how many sword venerables from the ancient sword continent, and how many experts were there? Most importantly, what would they get after winning the unparalleled sword venerable gathering? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 605. As the main hall of the 100 Saints Alliance and the center of the central sword domain, the area within 1,000 miles of the 100 Saints Mountain was empty. There were no cities or towns, which showed the uniqueness of the 100 Saints Mountain. However, after the 100 Saints Alliance decided to hold the unparalleled Sword Sovereign Conference, they built 4 temporary gathering places at the foot of the 100 Saints Mountain as temporary residences for swordsmen from all over the ancient sword continent. Otherwise, with so many sword sovereigns on the ancient sword continent, some would arrive early while some would arrive later. Most of them would arrive before the unparalleled Sword Sovereign Conference, so they could not have no place to stay. The 4 temporary gathering places were very large, and they built wooden houses one after another. Although they were temporary, the 100 Saints Alliance had put in a lot of effort, and the quality of the wooden houses was quite good. Chu Mu, riding on Bawang, also arrived at the Eastern Gathering Place. There was still a month before the unparalleled Sword Sovereign Conference began. Friend, your mount is not bad. I like it very much. Name a price. When Chu Mu stepped into the gathering place with Bawang, several sword sovereigns stopped them. One of them stared at Bawang with a burning gaze, and then said to Chu Mu, "Not for sale," Chu Mu replied indifferently. "Friend, you have to think carefully. If you miss this opportunity, you won't get another one." The other person's expression turned cold, and his tone carried a hint of threat. Chu Mu ignored him directly. It was meaningless to argue, but it seemed that he could not fight here. Looking at the swordsmen in standard armor standing not far away, it was obvious. They were the 100 Saints Alliance's Sword Saint Guards. Now, in order to maintain the security of the temporary gathering place, they had the right to kill. Once they fought, they would be captured by the Sword Saint Guards or even killed on the spot. No one was that stupid. Chu Mu ignored them and continued to walk forward with Bawang. The sword sovereigns had to dodge, otherwise, it would not look good if they were hit by Bawang's huge body. Damn it! Sword Senior, who had been rejected and ignored by Chu Mu, had a gloomy expression. His eyes flashed coldly as he stared at Chu Mu's back. "Second brother, let's check the other party's identity first, then we can discuss," a sword venerable at the side said. "Third brother, this is what you're good at. I'll leave it to you. Dig out every single detail about him." No problem. Chu Mu did not expect to provoke an enemy as soon as he arrived. However, there was nothing he could do about it. Bawang's appearance was very eye-catching, and the aura it emitted was very strong. Not only was it a good mount, it was also a good helper. Anyone who saw it would be tempted. Along the way, there were over 100 sword venerables who proposed to buy from Chu Mu, but they were all rejected by Chu Mu. However, they were all rejected by Chu Mu. Some of them would pester him a few times, and some would give up after being rejected. It was inevitable that some of them would harbor resentment in their hearts. Among them, there was a guy who was unwilling to give up. He kept following Chu Mu, looking like he would never give up. "Brother Chu, follow me. Let's register first, then we'll assign you a place to live." This guy was called Hua Buxi. He looked younger than Chu Mu, but it was unknown how old he was. He had a smile on his face, looking like an optimist. He always had a blade of grass in his mouth. Hua Buxi was a very friendly person. At first, he wanted to buy from Bawang, but after being rejected by Chu Mu, he was not angry at all. Instead, he insisted on following Chu Mu. According to him, he wanted to cultivate a relationship with Bawang. Once their relationship was developed, he would naturally take Bawang away. In this regard, Chu Mu felt helpless. Hua Buxi did not show any hostility. Instead, his friendly smile made people feel relaxed and happy. The person in charge of the registration was naturally arranged by the 100 Saints Alliance. After the registration, Chu Mu was given a wooden house. Coincidentally, it was right next to Hua Buxi's house, so they became neighbors. "Brother Chu, why don't we go shopping in the market?" Hua Buxi said. He stared at Bawang and said, "Bring this big guy." As if he had thought of something interesting, Hua Buxi laughed. Chu Mu had to bring Bawang along. Although it would cause a commotion, this was the ancient sword continent. There were giant beasts hundreds of meters long, so the commotion would not be too big. Moreover, he did not dare to let Bawang stay here alone. If something happened, it would be troublesome. A large number of sword venerables gathered, waiting for the start of the unparalleled sword venerable gathering. During this time, they cultivated, exchanged, and learned from each other. Some people also set up stalls to sell or exchange the treasures that they had obtained but could not use. There was not much time left. They tried their best to find ways to increase their strength in the shortest time possible. After all, they were people of status. They could not shout like peddlers. The sword venerables who set up stalls only placed the treasures they wanted to sell or exchange on a table in front of them. There was a sign beside the table that clearly stated whether the treasures were for sale or exchange. Some sword venerables were even more direct. They wrote the detailed price of the treasures they wanted to sell or specified the types of treasures they wanted to exchange. Chu Mu did not care. He and Hua Buxi wandered around the temporary market. When they walked past the stalls, they glanced at the signs and then looked at the treasures on the stalls. Chu Mu was enlightened. He walked toward a stall. There were not many treasures on the stall, but they were arranged neatly. There were elixirs, ores, and a few pieces of jade of different shape. Chu Mu recognized that the pieces of jade were precious gems that recorded secret technique. They were similar to the ones he found on the 4th level of the ancient sword tomb. "Brother Chu, is there something you want?" Hua Buxi asked. "Let's take a look," Chu Mu said, relying on his intuition. Chu Mu's intuition told him that there was a treasure suitable for him in this stall. He was just not sure which one it was. The owner of the stall, the sword venerable, was a middle-aged man with dark and rough skin. His cheeks were dry and his face was weathered. His eyes were closed and he seemed to be resting. However, his spiritual consciousness was paying attention to everything in the outside world. If there was any movement that was not beneficial to him, he would react. Chu Mu's gaze shifted from the stall to the owner. His sharp senses told him that the owner's muscles tensed up for a moment. Then, Chu Mu relaxed. He seemed to know that there was no fatal danger here. "This is a master who has been walking on the edge of danger all year round," Chu Mu said to himself. Although the owner had concealed his aura and it was difficult to detect, Chu Mu could still sense a dangerous aura coming from him. This was definitely the aura of a master who had been through countless battles of life and death. Even if he was not as strong as his opponent, he could still kill his opponent. He was a strong enemy. His gaze returned to the stall and locked onto the few pieces of jade. Chu Mu's intuition told him that the treasure that was useful to him was among those pieces of jade. He closed his eyes and released his spiritual consciousness to cover the few pieces of jade. He carefully identified them according to his intuition. Hua Buxi looked at Chu Mu. He was unusually quiet and did not disturb him. Bawang also stood quietly at the side. I want this piece of jade. Chu Mu pointed at one of the pieces of jade and said to the stall owner. 10 million pieces of supreme spiritual stones, the stall owner said without opening his eyes. 10 million. Hua Buxi's eyes bulged. Chu Mu frowned slightly. 10 million pieces of supreme spiritual stones for a piece of jade that he did not know what kind of skill it contained. To be honest, it was a little too much. If the skill inside was ordinary, it would be a waste. After thinking for a while, Chu Mu decided to trust his intuition. Taking out 10 million top-quality spirit stones was quite a lot. There was no way he could fit them all. Fortunately, Chu Mu had already exchanged most of the top-quality spirit stones for the corresponding spirit stone cards. After paying the stall owner, Chu Mu took the piece of jade away. I'll go back first, Chu Mu said to Hua Buxi. There's nothing much to see. I'll go back too, Hua Buxi said. The wooden house was big, but Bawang was not small. He could not walk into the wooden house. He could only wait outside and guard the door. Hua Buxi, on the other hand, was murmuring to Bawang. He was trying to build a relationship with Bawang, but Bawang ignored him completely. Inside the wooden house, Chu Mu took out the piece of jade that he had bought for 10 million pieces of supreme spiritual stones. He looked at it for a while, and his mind power spread out and wrapped around the jade. Then, his mind power began to seep into the jade. After 10 breaths, his mind power successfully entered the jade. A piece of information came into contact with Chu Mu's mind and entered Chu Mu's mind. The amount of information was not small. It took about half an hour for Chu Mu to finish receiving it. Truly a pillow sent to me when I was sleepy. Chu Mu looked at the shattered precious jade in his hand and his eyes flickered with a bright light as he silently spoke. He was worried about how to deal with Bawang. He was so big, and he was not a demonic beast. He could not be sealed in the beast sealing pearl. If he was alone, he might be targeted by other swordsmen. It would be troublesome. Now, the cultivation method that he had obtained from the jade was enough to solve this problem. The ancient beast-taming skill. The so-called beast-taming skill was a secret method for taming demonic beasts. It was rare and precious. However, the ancient beast-taming skill that Chu Mu had obtained was more precious than the ancient beast-taming skill. Chu Mu had always trusted his intuition. This time, he still trusted it. It did not disappoint him. His intuition had brought him great benefit. Although he hadn't started cultivating it yet, just from the description of the ancient beast-taming technique, Chu Mu knew that the ancient beast-taming technique's value wasn't normal. If the stall owner knew, he might regret it. 10 million pieces of supreme spiritual stones was a big loss. Fortunately, this kind of jade was very special. It could only be passed on once. Once the mind power seeped into it, the jade would automatically shatter after the information was passed on. Therefore, no one knew what kind of cultivation method was stored in this kind of jade. Otherwise, Chu Mu would not be able to obtain it. Even if he was fated to encounter it, he might have to pay a higher price to obtain it. He might even expose some of his trump cards that he was not willing to reveal. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 606. There were more and more honorable swordsmen in the 4 temporary gathering places, and there were fewer and fewer empty wooden huts. Chu Mu stayed in the wooden hut and used an entire night to comprehend the ancient beast-taming technique. He then spent another day to successfully cultivate the ancient beast-taming technique. The cultivation of the ancient beast taming skill could be said to be extremely difficult. It was so difficult that it was impossible to cultivate it. It could also be said to be very easy. It could be so easy that it only took 1 or 2 days to cultivate it. This was because the cultivation of the ancient beast taming skill required special conditions. The profound meaning of space. The reason why Chu-Mu was so happy and felt that this ancient beast taming skill could solve his problem was that it could not only successfully tame beasts into battle beasts, but it could also open up a battle beast space for battle beasts to enter. Swordsmen who did not understand the profound meaning of space would not be able to cultivate this ancient beast taming skill even if they obtained it. However, swordsmen who understood the profound meaning of space would be able to cultivate it in a short period of time. However, it was one thing to cultivate it successfully and another to perform it. It was especially important to perform it for the first time. It required the cooperation of the human and the battle beast. With the human as the main force and the battle beast as the support, the ancient beast taming skill could open up a battle beast space using the profound meaning of space. As long as the battle beast space was successfully opened up, the human would be able to let the battle beasts enter or exit the battle beast space at will. However, opening up the battle beast space would cause a huge commotion. Chu-Mu planned to leave the gathering place and open it in a remote place to prevent the profound meaning of space from being discovered. Chu-Mu firmly rejected Hua Buxie's request to follow him. Although Hua Buxie gave Chu-Mu a good impression, it was not to the point where he could reveal his trump card to the other party. Hua Buxie was not an insensible person. He could hear the determination in Chu-Mu's tone. He did not feel angry because he knew that everyone had their own secret. Secrets that they did not like to be known by others had nothing to do with their relationship. Some secrets were best kept to oneself. Riding on Bawang, Chu-Mu quickly left the gathering place and looked for a remote place. Not long after Chu-Mu left, a few swordsmen immediately set off to follow Chu-Mu's trail. This place is remote enough. Bawang stopped in his tracks. He was in the depths of a forest and the light was dim. Not far away there was a gurgling stream, and the pleasant sound of flowing water could be heard. All around there was silence. This place was already very far away from the temporary gathering place, about a few hundred miles away. The aura released by Chu-Mu when he opened up the war beast space would not be discovered. Jumping down from Bawang's back, Chu-Mu's essence, chi, and spirit had already finished adjusting their breathing on the way here. They were all at their peak. Exhaling softly, Chu-Mu looked around and said, "We've followed you all the way here. It's time for you to come out." His tone sounded as if he was chatting with a friend. "Ha ha ha ha, looks like you're quite brave." Loud laughter rang out as one figure after another appeared, forming an encirclement around Chu-Mu and Bawang. There were a total of 4 swordsmen, all of whom were sword venerables. "So it's you." Chu-Mu glanced at them. These 4 sword venerables were the ones who had proposed to buy Bawang from him when he had just arrived at the temporary gathering place. They were the ones who had been enraged because they had been rejected by him. It looked like they had been keeping an eye on him all this time, and had immediately chased after him when he had just left the temporary gathering place. "Brat, originally, if you had obediently sold the enormous savage beast to us, we would have been able to coexist peacefully. Unfortunately, you didn't know what was good for you. You refused a toast and instead wanted to drink a forfeit. Now, there's no longer a chance for regret." The leading sword saint laughed coldly as he spoke to Chu-Mu in an evil tone. These 4 sword venerables were all in their 30s, and the murderous aura they emitted was very strong. Obviously, they were ruthless people whose hands were stained with blood. Chu-Mu, who had passed the sword venerable assessment, knew that the real sword venerables were extraordinary. Therefore, he did not underestimate these 4 sword venerables at all. These 4 sword venerables seemed to be looking down on Chu-Mu. However, if one looked carefully into their eyes, one could see that there was a trace of seriousness in their eyes. As sword venerables, how could they be arrogant and conceited to be able to survive until now, and their hands were stained with blood? Appearances were just appearances used to confuse the enemy. You shouldn't have come. You've lost a few lives for nothing, Chu Mu said indifferently. It seemed that he did not put these four in his eyes. Bawang shook his head slightly, and the sound of his nostrils was very loud, as if he was sneezing. A pair of golden eyes stared at one of the sword venerables. Kill! Almost at the same time, both sides shouted and directly drew their sword. Bawang also moved. With a whoosh, Bawang turned into a ray of light, and rushed at full speed towards one of the sword venerables. He opened his sharp claws and fiercely clawed at the air, leaving a few clear scratches, and a cold aura spread out. The sword venerables were shocked, and his pupils contracted rapidly. Obviously, he did not expect Bawang's speed to be so fast. His well-trained consciousness came into play, and almost instinctively, he waved his sword to block Bawang's claw. Moreover, he used the inertia of the force to retreat, and used his movement skill to avoid Bawang's other claw attack. In just a moment, in a thousandth of a second, Bawang completed the attack with both of his claws. One claw was blocked, and the other was avoided. However, only then did he show his trump card. The tail that was longer than his body suddenly pierced out from below. It was a blind spot, and the sword venerables did not expect this at all. Moreover, the speed of the tail was faster and more sudden than the speed of the claws. With a poochie sound, the incomparably sharp tail instantly pierced through the sword venerable's abdomen. A tyrannical force surged, and a violent wild beast force blasted into the sword venerable's body, shattering all of his internal organs. In less than a breath's time, one of the four sword venerables died under Bawang's tail. The other three sword venerables attacked Chu Mu, and the moment they attacked, they used powerful sword skills. However, their sword skills all missed, because they appeared and disappeared, as if they had never appeared. "Third brother, be careful!" A cry of alarm rang out, and Chu Mu's figure appeared behind one of the sword venerables, maintaining the posture of drawing his sword. It looked as if he was about to draw his sword, but also as if he had already drawn his sword and sheathed it. The sword venerable's face was filled with astonishment, and then it turned into pain. He wanted to shout, but he could not make a sound. His body trembled, and the clothes around his waist were torn apart, revealing his skin. A slanted red circle appeared on his skin, as if there was a thread wrapped around it. In the next breath, the sword venerable's upper body began to slide down along the slanted red line. "Third brother! Third brother!" The remaining two sword venerables' eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. "Kill him, avenge the three of us. Fifth brother is also dead, kill. If you want to kill me, then you must be prepared to be killed by me." Chu Mu smiled slightly and used the inverse space step, appearing beside another sword venerables, and thrusting his sword. This sword venerables was ranked second among the four, and his strength was also relatively strong. He narrowly dodged Chu Mu's sword, but his anger did not make him lose his mind. He turned around, counterattacked, dodged and slashed out with his sword. Blood splattered, and an arm flew high into the air, holding a sword in the palm of that arm. A mournful scream resounded through the forest, and the hand that did not hold the sword was equivalent to being crippled. In the next breath, a cold light flashed, enlarged in front of his eyes, and pierced through his throat. At the same time, on the other side, Bawang's sharp claws tore apart the body of the last sword venerables. In less than 10 breaths of time, the four sword venerables, who were not weak, died under Chu Mu's sword, Bawang's claws and tail, without even displaying their true strength. It was not that they were too weak, but that Chu Mu and Bawang were too strong. Although Chu Mu had only passed the sword venerable examination a year ago, his strength could not be calculated with common sense, and Bawang's strength and speed were too astonishing, comparable to those top sword venerables. Although the four sword venerables who wanted to kill Chu Mu and snatch Bawang were not weak, They could only be considered to be in the middle of the sword venerables level. After killing the 4 of them, Chu Mu did not feel the slightest burden. He skillfully put away their top-grade spatial bracers, swords, and other valuable items, and then destroyed the corpses. In order to avoid being disturbed, Chu Mu rode Bawang and left the place. After traveling for about 10 miles, he finished adjusting his breathing and jumped off Bawang's back, beginning to use the ancient beast taming skill. The first step was the beast taming contract. This required the cooperation of some hand seals. For Chu Mu it was not difficult and he easily used it. A strange imprint condensed from Chu Mu's essence, blood, and consciousness appeared out of thin air, steadily flying towards Bawang's forehead. Bawang's intelligence was not low, and Chu Mu had also told it. Bawang did not object, allowing the imprint to land on its forehead. Soon after, a strange rustling sound rang out, and the beast-taming imprint slowly fused into Bawang's forehead, turning into a pattern. Chu Mu only felt that there was a very intimate connection between him and Bawang. He could feel Bawang's emotions. At this moment, Bawang was very happy, just like a child. In fact, Bawang was only born less than a year ago, so it was indeed a child. Next, it's the second step. Bawang, you have to cooperate well. Chu Mu patted Bawang's head and said. Bawang's eyes narrowed slightly, as if it was enjoying it. Taking a deep breath, Chu Mu took 3 steps back. His eyes flickered with an extremely intense light, as if it was going to pierce through the void. His hands waved again, forming layers of illusions that overlapped each other. It was extremely profound. The fluctuations of the profound of space were also released from Chu Mu's hands, spreading out like ripples. In the blink of an eye, it covered 100 meters. Bawang's eyes were serious, completely focused on Chu Mu's hands, waiting for the best opportunity. Opening a beast space was not an easy task, so Chu Mu focused all his attention on it. As his hands moved, gradually, a transparent dot of light appeared between his hands. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 607. An astonishing shockwave rushed into the sky, and a terrifying shockwave wreaked havoc. All the trees within 1,000 meters were destroyed, as if they had been sucked into a spatial crack, disappearing without a trace. Bawang rushed forward, and in front of him was like a water surface. Ripples spread out, and Bawang's head entered first, followed by his neck, and then his body. In the blink of an eye, Bawang seemed to have entered the void and disappeared. All the shockwaves calmed down, and Chu Mu heaved a sigh of relief. He hurriedly used the profound meaning of space and quickly left. About a quarter of an hour after Chu Mu left, a few figures appeared in the sky like ghosts. They quickly landed, checked around, and communicated with each other before leaving with some doubt. About 2 to 4 hours later, a group of swordsmen also arrived. They searched around but couldn't find anything, so they left while cursing. They thought that some treasure had appeared, but they didn't expect to find nothing. Maybe someone had already taken it, or maybe there was no treasure. Chu Mu took a detour and returned to the temporary gathering place. No one knew what he was going to do. He directly entered the wooden house and closed the door. Chu Mu was in a good mood. After using the ancient beast taming technique, he established a contract with Bawang. From then on, if Bawang died, his profound meaning would be damaged. If he died, Bawang would also die. In other words, even if an expert took a fancy to Bawang, they wouldn't be able to take him away. Chu Mu could also clearly feel the existence of the war beast space, and could also feel the existence of Bawang. It was as if it existed in the void, beside him, invisible and untouchable. However, as long as he was willing, he could summon Bawang. The deaths of the 4 sword saints didn't attract anyone's attention. As time passed, more and more sword saints came to the temporary gathering place. Occasionally, they would walk around the temporary market to see if there were any suitable treasures. However, other than obtaining the ancient beast taming technique, They basically didn't gain anything. Most of the time, Chu Mu stayed in the wooden house to cultivate, preparing for the upcoming unparalleled sword venerable gathering. During this period, Hua Buxi asked about Bawang's whereabouts several times. Chu Mu used the excuse that Bawang was in the care of a friend to brush him off. Without Bawang, Hua Buxi rarely went to Chu Mu. Chu Mu was also happy to have peace and quiet. In the blink of an eye, the time was up. Tomorrow is the unparalleled sword venerable assembly. Inside the wooden house, Chu Mu opened his eyes. His blood seemed to be on fire. Just like Chu Mu, the sword-revered guild members in the temporary gathering place all had their blood boiling and their eyes shining brightly. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. The next day, before the sun had risen, the sword venerables had already left the wooden house and were waiting outside. There was no other way. No one could remain calm during the first unparalleled sword venerable meeting. The first unparalleled sword venerable meeting has begun. The first 10,000 sword venerables to reach the 100 Saints Mountain will be qualified. A loud and clear voice seemed to have come from the sky. It reverberated throughout the area and fell into the ears of every sword venerable. 10,000! The sword venerable's eyes widened, their eyeballs almost popping out. There were so many sword venerables in the ancient sword continent. There were at least a few 100,000 sword venerables here. Among so many sword venerables, only 10,000 would be qualified. For a moment, the sword venerables smelled the scent of cruelty. With a whoosh, someone was the first to move. The 100 Saints Mountain was the highest mountain in the central sword domain. It was 9,999 meters tall. The 100 Saints Alliance's main hall was located at the top of the mountain. 9,999 meters was nothing to a sword venerable. They could climb it in a short time. However, the 100 Saints Mountain was no ordinary mountain. Once they entered the range of the 100 Saints Mountain, even Sword of Gojoseon would not be able to fly, unless they were sword saints. Moreover, as they climbed, the higher they climbed, the greater the pressure. As a result, it was impossible to determine how much time it would take to reach the top of the mountain. The sword venerables in the 4 temporary gathering places all moved. They used their body movement skills and rushed out. Some were as fast as the wind, some were like flowing water, some were as fierce and violent as raging fire, and some were as frightening as the thunder. Among the several 100,000 sword venerables, only 10,000 could enter the true unparalleled sword venerable meeting. The others would all be eliminated. This was completely different from choosing one out of several dozen people. If 1 out of 500,000 was chosen, 49 would be eliminated. However, if 1 out of 500,000 was chosen, 490,000 would be eliminated. The difference between 49 and 490,000 was extremely huge. Not only was the 100 Saints Mountain tall, but it also occupied a large area. The several 100,000 sword venerables entered and spread out. They used various methods to quickly rush to the top. In the blink of an eye, most of the sword venerables had crossed several hundred meters. They seemed to be able to reach the top very quickly. After 3 seconds, most of the sword venerables had crossed 11,011 meters. Chu Mu only felt his body sink. The suction force from the ground had doubled, and the pressure from the surrounding space had doubled as well. His speed immediately dropped, and he had to use even more power to maintain his original speed. To the sword venerables, this pressure was not strong enough. They increased the output of their power and continued to rush up at high speed. In the blink of an eye, they had crossed 2,222 meters. Chu Mu once again felt the suction force from below double, and the pressure from the surrounding space doubled as well. In order to maintain their speed, the sword venerables had no choice but to increase the output of their power. The difference between the several 100,000 sword venerables began to appear. The stronger sword venerables remained at the front, while the weaker sword venerables fell behind. However, some sword venerables advanced bravely, striving to stand out from the several 100,000 people in the shortest amount of time possible and successfully become one of the 10,000 people who reached the top of the 100 Saints Mountain. No one attacked each other. If they did, they would definitely slow down their own speed and lead to chaos. If they were unlucky, they might even end up worse off. As a result, all the sword venerables were focused on rushing up. At 3,333 meters, the suction force and spatial pressure doubled again. Some of the weaker sword venerables had a difficult expression. They clenched their teeth and endured, but their speed had clearly dropped. Although the pressure was great, Chu Mu was still able to endure it. His speed did not change, and his energy consumption only increased slightly. According to the current situation, Chu Mu was at the very front of the group. He was very likely to become one of the 10,000 sword venerables who reached the top of the 100 Saints Mountain. However, there were no absolutes in the world. Right now, they had only reached a third of the 100 Saints Mountain. Many sword venerables were still preserving their strength, waiting for the final moment to erupt. 3 figures hovered in the clouds above. They were all sword saint experts, and they were currently looking down. The first unparalleled sword venerable meeting. It's very memorable. Hundreds of thousands of sword venerables competing together. This is the only time this has happened. With this first time, there will be a second and third time. What interests me is that there are a few decent little fellows among the hundreds of thousands of sword venerables. As he spoke, the sword saint pointed with his finger. Oh, let me see. The eyes of the other 2 sword saints flashed as they stared at the so-called little fellows. These so-called little fellows were all above 30 years old. However, in the eyes of sword saints who were hundreds and thousands of years old, they were indeed little fellows. They are calm and composed, and their divine light is restrained. They are indeed extraordinary. Their strength should be in the top 100 among the hundreds of thousands of sword venerables. Let's look at the others. We might find something even more surprising. Among the hundreds of thousands of sword venerables, there were veteran sword venerables and new sword venerables. As long as one did not die after obtaining the title of sword venerable and did not break through to the divine condensation realm, they would still be sword venerables. These sword venerables usually cultivated for more than 10 years or even dozens of years more than other sword venerables. Their accumulation was deeper and their strength was shocking. Of course, the longer one cultivated, the more powerful they would be. Some people were born to be powerful. Even if their cultivation time was not as long as others, their talent and comprehension were shocking. Their strength was terrifying. Go, go, go. I must reach the top 10,000. No matter what, I cannot give up. I must be one of the top 10,000. Many sword venerables screamed in their hearts. They gathered their strength and channeled their sword yuan into their legs. They used their profound to resist the gravity and spatial binding power of the 100 Saints Mountain, maintaining their speed. The 100 Saints Mountain, which was 9,999 meters tall, seemed to be thousands of times longer in the eyes of the sword venerables. It seemed to be an endless path. When they raised their heads, they could not see the end. It made them feel hopeless. At this moment, they had only reached 4,444 meters. The angle and the increased gravity and spatial binding power brought even more pressure to the sword venerables. This pressure did not only affect their bodies, but also their minds. It was a double pressure. 5,555 meters. 6,666 meters. At this point, they had already reached 2/3 of the height of the 100 Saints Mountain. There was only 1/3 left. Those sword venerables who were originally calm began to look serious. At this moment, the gravity and spatial binding power had already reached a level where they had to pay attention to it. Chu Mu's expression also became serious. He had planned to use his profound of space, but his sharp intuition told him that there were some eyes watching him from somewhere. He subconsciously did not want to expose himself. Most importantly, among the hundreds of thousands of sword venerables, many of them were unfathomable. Many of them were definitely hiding their strength. Perhaps once he used his profound of space, his aura would be immediately detected by some people. Of course, if Chu-Mu was sure that he could not make it to the top 10,000, he would definitely use his profound of space. Otherwise, no matter how much strength he had, he would still be eliminated. It would be a huge joke. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 608. 7,777 meters. Looking with the naked eye, the hundreds of thousands of sword sovereigns were divided into several levels. The highest level had already reached 7,777 meters, while the lowest level was still struggling at 5,555 meters. At this level, the difference in strength between sword sovereigns could be clearly seen. The pressure from the 100 Saints Mountain was the same for everyone. However, different sword sovereigns had different abilities in all aspects, so their resistance to the pressure varied as well. Chu-Mu discovered that his powerful body had an obvious resistance to pressure. For example, his second-level Sky Desolation sword body was 10 times stronger than ordinary Origin Realm swordsman. He could still withstand the pressure from the 100 Saints Mountain. As he rushed up, Chu-Mu also discovered that some of the swordsmen around him had extraordinary bodies. Clearly, they had cultivated some kind of body-refining technique. Their bodies were much stronger than ordinary Origin Realm swordsmen. 8,888 meters. The peak of the 100 Saints Mountain was already right in front of him. However, the pressure increased once again, causing every sword sovereign's speed to decrease. Their bodies became extremely heavy, and their footsteps became heavy as well. It was as if they were tied up with two mountains. Every time he took a step forward, his foot would land heavily on the ground. With a bang, it was extremely shocking, and the mountain rocks were shattered. Because the hundreds of thousands of sword sovereigns were scattered, charging towards the peak from all directions of the 100 Saints Mountain, the visible sword sovereigns were only a small portion of them. At the last 1,111 meters, the sword sovereigns no longer held back and unleashed their full strength. Rumbling sounds came from the bodies of many sword sovereigns like rolling thunder. Powerful auras exploded as their speed instantly increased. With a whoosh, they surpassed the other sword sovereigns. Even the sword sovereigns who fell behind didn't give up. They unleashed their full strength and even used secret technique. Even if they were eliminated, they didn't have any regrets. After all, there was a difference between the strong and the weak. 9,999 meters was right in front of them. It won't be difficult to enter the top 10,000. Chu-Mu estimated. He didn't plan on using the profound of space. However, other than the profound of space, he had already used all his strength. Finally, after rushing past 9,999 meters and reaching the peak of the 100 Sacred Mountains, the sword venerables suddenly felt as if they had broken free from their shackles and were about to soar into the sky. Of course, it was still impossible to fly here. However, because the terrifying pressure from before had disappeared, it suddenly became extremely easy. In just a few breaths of time, the sword venerables had adapted. Even if it's the 10,000th place, I'm going to make it in. The sword venerables who had yet to reach the top roared in anger. With a bang, they crashed into an invisible wall. The invisible wall had a soft and tough power, and instantly, the sword venerables who had crashed into it were bounced away. What happened? I've already rushed to the top of the mountain. Why can't I go up? Many sword venerables were blocked by the invisible wall. Their expressions changed drastically as they shouted in shock. Chu-Mu and the other sword venerables who had already reached the peak of the 100 Saints Mountain were also very confused. They didn't understand what was going on. All of you have not entered the top 10,000 and have been eliminated. You may turn around and leave now. An aged yet resonant voice seemed to descend from the sky. It was vast and mighty, and its might was boundless. Not in the top 10,000. The Sword Venerables' faces turned deathly pale. Even though they had already thought that they wouldn't be able to enter the top 10,000, they still tried their best to fight for that slim chance. Until now, when they were told that they wouldn't be able to enter the top 10,000, the word eliminated was like a huge hammer smashing on their hearts, making it difficult for them to breathe. The reality was so cruel. The difference in strength meant that they had no fate with the unparalleled Sword Venerables. Even though they were extremely unwilling, even though some Sword Venerables felt that they hadn't used their full strength, they had already been eliminated. They couldn't blame anyone. If they had to blame someone, they could only blame themselves for not grasping the right time. With a trace of unwillingness, these Sword Venerables all turned around and looked back at the 10,000 Sword Venerables who had reached the top of the mountain. They suddenly shook their heads and strode down the mountain. It was said that going up the mountain was easier than going down the mountain. However, it didn't apply here, because the pressure on going up the mountain was getting stronger and stronger, while the pressure on going down the mountain was getting weaker and weaker. Chu Mu and the 10,000 Sword Venerables stood on the spacious land on the top of the mountain. 10,000 meters away there was a very large palace. It was grand and ancient, and it was the main hall of the 100 Saints Alliance. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for successfully standing out from hundreds of thousands of Sword Venerables and entering the real unparalleled Sword Venerables Conference. A voice came from the main hall of the 100 Saints Alliance. Then, a figure walked out of the main hall. Compared to the open door of the main hall, the figure was like an ant. However, no one felt that he was small. He had a sense of majesty that stood between the heaven and earth. He was wearing a black robe and looked to be in his 40s. However, his hair was white, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes were obvious. His fair skin was full of vicissitudes of life. His actual age was far beyond what he looked like. A vague aura surrounded him. When everyone looked at him, they felt that his body seemed to be infinitely enlarged. However, he had never moved. With a flash, like an illusion, he had already arrived in front of everyone. It seemed that he had been standing here for a long time and had become one with the 100 Saints Mountain under his feet. All kinds of mysteries seemed to emanate from his body. A sword saint. He must be a sword saint. Usually, it was extremely difficult for swordsmen to see a sword saint. Even the important disciples of the top 10 sword clans could not see a sword saint unless there was a major event. After all, there were not many sword saints in the top 10 sword clans. However, they were all at the top. They had long stopped caring about worldly affairs and focused on cultivation. Even if they were strong-willed, it would be a lie to say that they weren't excited when they saw a sword saint standing in front of them and speaking. However, they were able to control their emotions very well and quickly adjusted themselves. Congratulations again. You will be able to obtain a great opportunity. The sword saint smiled mysteriously again. What he said confused Chu Mu and the 10,000 Sword Venerables because they did not know why the Unparalleled Sword Venerables Conference was suddenly held. There should be a purpose for everything. The Unparalleled Sword Venerables Conference had never been held before, but it was held this time. There must be a reason for it. What was the so-called great opportunity? For a moment, everyone was very curious. However, the Sword Saint did not explain. Even if some Sword Venerables were anxious, there was nothing they could do. They could not pull out their swords and force the Sword Saint to speak. You can cultivate here for a month. After a month, the real Unparalleled Sword Venerables Conference will be held. The Sword Saint changed the topic and said with a smile, "During this month, you can choose to give up. However, those who give up will have to leave this place." Give up? The 10,000 Sword Venerables did not have such thoughts. They had come all the way here to participate in the Unparalleled Sword Venerables Conference and stand out among hundreds of thousands of Sword Venerables. How could they give up? The word "give up" was crushed by the sword venerables before it clearly appeared in their minds. However, they became excited. Cultivate here for a month? This was the main hall of the 100 Saints Alliance. Normally, those who were not at the level of the sword of Gojoseon were not qualified to enter this place. They were only sword venerables. Although they were one level lower than the sword of Gojoseon, the gap between their strength was more than 100 times. Many sword venerables did not even know if they could break through to the next level. In addition, the spiritual chi in this place was unusually pure and very rich. It was very helpful for cultivation. Chumu didn't feel too happy because the spirit aura here was pure and dense. It had nothing to do with him. What he needed was pure desolate aura. Perhaps the sword origin of other sword venerables would be purer if they cultivated here, but it would be very difficult for Chumu. It was very disadvantageous for him. Fortunately, Chumu had a rare treasure like the Millennium Stalactite. During this month, you can communicate and learn from each other. However, you must not have any conflict. Otherwise, you will be expelled, the Sword Saint said in a serious tone. This was not a warning, but a fact. All right. Next, someone will arrange accommodation for you. After the Sword Saint finished speaking, he disappeared instantly as if he had never appeared. Because the area was very spacious, the 10,000 sword venerables standing at the top of the 100 Saints Mountain did not look crowded at all. Instead, it looked very loose. Where's that wild beast of yours? A voice rang out next to Chumu's ear. He turned around and saw a pair of cold eyes staring at him, emitting a cold aura. So it's you. Chumu smiled. You want your sword back? This person was the sword venerables who tried to kill Chumu when he was riding on Bawang. In the end, not only did he not succeed, but he was also defeated by Chumu and escaped. Hearing Chumu mention this, the sword venerable's expression became even colder. Just you wait. In a month, I will personally make you kneel and beg for mercy. The sword venerable said ruthlessly and turned to leave. Junior brother Chu, I didn't expect you to be here too. A gentle voice sounded. Chumu turned around and was stunned. He then smiled. Senior brother Chun, long time no see. This person had shoulder-length hair, and his eyes were almost narrowed into a line. There was always a faint smile on his face. He was one of the great Koan sword mansion's sons of swords, Chen Bu. Two people walked over with Chen Bu. It was a man and a woman. The man wore a golden robe with dragon patterns on it. His aura was domineering as if he was looking down on the world. Meanwhile, the woman wore a light yellow robe and a veil. Her aura fluctuated gently as if it was a musical note. Chumu immediately knew the identities of these two people. Huangfu Huangtian and Shangguan Qinin. Although he was a little surprised, it was not impossible for Huangfu Huangtian, Shangguan Qinin, and Chen Buer to make it into the top 10,000. After all, they had been sword venerables for more than 10 years. They had extraordinary talent and were considered rather powerful among the sword venerables. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 609. Huangfu Huangtian had once said that he wanted to fight with Chumu. Today was an opportunity. There were a total of 10,000 sword venerables participating in the unparalleled sword venerables gathering. It was possible for anyone to fight against anyone. Many sword venerables chatted with one another. Soon, someone came to lead the 10,000 sword venerables to their temporary residences. The person leading the way was an expert on the same level as the sword of Gojoseon. One had to admit that the 100 Saints Alliance was powerful. Even an expert on the same level as the sword of Gojoseon could only act as a guide here. Of course, this was for the sword of Gojoseon who wasn't very powerful. Or those who didn't have the title of sword of Gojoseon and only had the strength of the sword of Gojoseon. This kind of swordsmen usually had their potential exhausted. It was very difficult for them to improve further. For this unparalleled sword venerables gathering, the 100 Saints Alliance put in a lot of effort. They specially opened up a residence at the top of the 100 Saints Mountain and built 10,000 sword towers. It was just enough for 10,000 sword venerables to stay. These sword towers weren't built casually. They were put in a lot of effort and had all kinds of seals. Even if a sword venerables attacked with their full strength, they wouldn't be able to shake them at all. This was because this was only the first unparalleled sword venerables gathering. There would be a second and third one in the future. They couldn't just build them every time they held a gathering. They could just build them and use them for thousands of years. There was no difference between 10,000 sword towers. The sword of Gojoseon who led the way left. The sword venerables could choose freely. Usually, the sword venerables who had a good relationship with them would choose the sword tower nearby to stay. Chumu randomly chose a sword tower. This sword tower had a total of 3 floors. After entering the sword tower, there was a stele. The stele was about 3 meters tall and was completely black. 3 words were written at the top, leaving names stele. Chumu curiously walked over. After thinking for a bit, he used his finger as a sword to condense his sword intent and wrote on the first line of the recognition monument. His brush moved like a dragon, dancing like a dragon and dancing like a phoenix. 2 bold and powerful words appeared on the monument. Chumu. These 2 people emitted a strong and sharp pure sword will that contained a faintly discernible fluctuation. It was very strange and was completely different from ordinary sword will. It seemed to be of a higher level because of the embryonic form of the sword soul. As Chumu's name landed on the nameplate, 4 words automatically appeared behind his name. Supreme Sword Gentian. There were a total of 6 words, releasing a golden radiance, shining brightly, extremely eye-catching. Withdrawing his finger and dispersing the sword will, Chumu stared at the words on the monument of names. He smiled and walked into the sword tower. He was the first owner of this sword tower. After him, there might be a second or a third. The names would be passed down one by one, and his name would be left on the nameplate. He would be ranked first and would be known by those who came after him. This was also a kind of glory. It had to be said that the 100 Saints Alliance was quite resourceful. The first floor of the sword tower was naturally the place to cultivate sword arts. The surrounding walls were covered with seals. Even if one used his full strength, he wouldn't be able to break through them. Therefore, one could rest assured. Moreover, the area of the first floor was more than 1,000 meters. The second floor was the place to rest. The third floor was the place to cultivate sword origin and comprehend sword will profound, etc. There was only 1 month, which could be said to be very short. It might pass in the blink of an eye. To the sword venerables, it was very difficult for their strength to increase by leaps and bounds in just 1 month. However, they could use this 1 month to adjust themselves. If they made good use of it, their strength would increase a little. Moreover, they could also understand the background of the other sword venerables. Only by knowing one's enemy and oneself could one win 100 battles. Chumu stayed in the sword tower to cultivate. He realized that the speed of comprehending sword will and profound here was faster than in other places. Of course, it couldn't be compared to the myriad origin palace and the famous sword tower. The benefits of having a high comprehension ability were once again displayed. Chumu's comprehension speed was faster than the other sword venerables. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed. Chumu's sword will was still at 70%, but he felt that it wasn't far from 71%. Today was the 11th day since Chumu stayed in the sword tower. There were still 19 days before the unparalleled sword venerable assembly. Chumu's sword tower welcomed a guest, Su Haosha. Brother Chu, I said 3 years ago that we might have a battle. It seems like it might happen this time. Su Haosha sat opposite Chumu and said with a smile. It hasn't been 3 years. Brother Su's aura has become even more obscure and unfathomable. Chumu also smiled. He wasn't naive enough to think that others wouldn't be able to increase their strength just because his strength was increasing. Every genius, as long as they were in a suitable environment, would be able to increase their strength rapidly. 3 years ago, Su Haoshao was already the #1 sword hunter in the sacred wildland city. 3 years later, he was even stronger. Su Haoshao didn't know who Su Haoshao was. The two of them could be considered friends. They met again after 3 years, and it was during the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly. Therefore, they could talk about many things. First, it was about the sacred wildland city. The once prosperous giant beast bank had started to decline for some unknown reason. In the end, it had fallen into decline. Your reputation is still as resounding in the sacred wildland city. Su Haoshao smiled. It's just a false reputation. Chumu smiled. This kind of reputation was dispensable to him. After 3 years, you were able to pass the Sword Venerable exam. Your strength must have increased rapidly. However, those who are participating in the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly are all outstanding Sword Venerables. You don't have any advantage among these 10,000 people. Su Haoshao changed the topic and said, I know. I'm participating in the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly because I want to fight with the Sword Venerables of the ancient Sword Continent. Chumu said, Brother Su, you're a member of the 100 Saints Alliance. Do you know why the 100 Saints Alliance suddenly held the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly? There's a reason behind it, but my status isn't high enough, so I don't know. Su Haoshao thought for a while and said, Don't worry. The 100 Saints Alliance exists to protect the ancient Sword Continent. They won't do anything that will harm the ancient Sword Continent. As for the purpose of holding the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly, I think we'll know after the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly is over. Chumu nodded and didn't dwell on this question. If he could find out, he would naturally find out. Brother Chu, how much do you know about the Sword Venerables participating in the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly? Su Haoshao changed the topic and asked. I don't know much. Chumu said. I'm here today to catch up with you. Secondly, I'm here to tell you some information. Su Haoshao smiled. Brother Su, please go ahead. Chumu put on a respectful expression. Some people are like Brother Chu, wholeheartedly cultivating and ignoring outside matters. However, some people like to understand enough information first. I got this information from a few Sword Venerables who put in the effort to understand the situation. Su Haoshao said, to be able to stand out among hundreds of thousands of Sword Venerables, each of the 10 Sword Venerables is extraordinary. They're much stronger than ordinary Sword Venerables. Among them, they've been selected as the strongest Sword Venerables. Top 10 Sword Venerables? Chumu's interest was piqued. He wanted to know which 10 people were selected as the top 10 Sword Venerables. One had to know that this was equivalent to being selected from hundreds of thousands of Sword Venerables. Although it hadn't been verified, it still showed how powerful these people were. Otherwise, how could they be publicly acknowledged? Brother Chu, do you know that we've divided Sword Venerables into several levels? Beginner Sword Venerables, Intermediate Sword Venerables, Advanced Sword Venerables, Peak Sword Venerables, and Ultimate Sword Venerables. Su Haoshao said, letting Chumu understand a little. Like the opponents in the Sword Venerables assessment, they barely have the strength of beginner Sword Venerables. If you defeat them, you can become a Sword Venerables. However, most of the Sword Venerables are only beginner Sword Venerables. They need to cultivate for a long time to become stronger. Among the 10,000 Sword Venerables who entered the Unparalleled Sword Venerables Assembly, the weakest one has the strength of an advanced Sword Venerables. There's no ranking for the top 10 Sword Venerables. They're considered the strongest among the 10,000 Sword Venerables. I'll tell you in detail one by one. Su Haoshao smiled. The first one is called Lai Shan Hu, 43 years old, known as Lai Shan Sword Venerables. He comes from one of the top 10 sword sects, inheriting the mountain sword Tao. He became a sword venerables 20 years ago. After 10 years of seclusion, he already has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The second one is called Lu Xiaolu, 37 years old, known as Xiao Lu sword venerables. He also comes from one of the top 10 sword sects, inheriting the limitless sword Tao. He became a sword venerables 15 years ago and also has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The third one is called Luo Fei, 39 years old, known as Luosha sword venerables. He comes from one of the top 10 sword sects, inheriting the Luosha sword Tao. He became a sword venerables 16 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The fourth one is called Feng Wujin, 45 years old, known as Feng Wu sword venerables. He comes from the overseas sword region, inheriting the sealing heaven sword Tao. He became a sword venerables 21 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The fifth one is called Wan Qingxian, 48 years old, known as Flying Celestial Sword Venerables. He is a scattered swordsman, inheriting the Flying Celestial Sword Tao. He became a sword venerables 20 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The sixth one is called Jingyang, 35 years old, known as Tianyang Sword Venerables. He comes from the overseas sword region, inheriting the true Yang sword Tao. He became a sword venerables 13 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The seventh one is called Xiaoho Wang, 36 years old, known as Earth King sword venerables, inheriting the Earth sword Tao. He comes from one of the top 10 sword sects. He became a sword venerables 12 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The eighth one is called Ji Qingyu, 39 years old, known as Golden Jade Sword Venerables, inheriting the Jade Sword Tao. He comes from one of the top 10 sword sects. He became a sword venerables 15 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. The ninth one is called Yun Yun, 34 years old, known as White Cloud Sword Venerables, inheriting the Cloud Sword Tao. She comes from one of the top 10 sword sects. She became a sword venerables 14 years ago and has the strength of an ultimate sword venerables. What about the 10th one? Su Haosha suddenly stopped his introduction. Chumu asked. That's me. Su Haosha smiled. Chumu was shocked. He expected Su Haosha to be strong and unfathomable, but he didn't expect him to be so strong that he could be recognized as one of the top 10 sword venerables. This hasn't been confirmed yet. It's just a result of some sword venerables investigation, so it might not be the truth. Su Haosha said, but it can't be underestimated. If there are no accidents, there's an 80% chance. Chumu said. The two chatted for a while more before Su Haosha got up and left, leaving Chumu alone to think. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 610. The top 10 sword venerables brought great pressure to Chumu, and at the same time, it also stimulated his battle intent. Chumu estimated the 5 levels of sword venerables and felt that his strength should be between advanced sword venerables and pinnacle sword venerables. Among the 10,000 sword venerables, he was only in the middle. Although he knew that his potential wasn't bad, it was still a short time. The possibility of him contending with those ultimate sword venerables who had lived for more than a decade or two was very small. Chumu felt that it would be difficult for him to obtain a good ranking. Fortunately, he wasn't here to compete for the title of unparalleled under the heavens, but to fight with the powerful sword venerables. He wanted to learn their strengths from the battle and use them to improve himself. However, the current situation was beyond his expectation, and it was also beyond the expectations of the other sword venerables. A month had passed, and the unparalleled under the heavens sword venerables assembly had officially begun. Chu Mu and the other 10,000 sword venerables knew that the unparalleled under the heavens sword venerables assembly was divided into 3 stages, and each stage had a unparalleled under the heavens sword venerables. This meant that any sword venerables had the opportunity to obtain the title of unparalleled under the heavens. Even Su Haoshao, who was a member of the 100 Saints Alliance, didn't know about this. At this moment, in front of Chu Mu and the other 10,000 sword venerables was a bronze gate. The gate was closed, and there were countless runes on it, revealing an ancient aura. Above the bronze gate was a plaque with 3 ancient words written on it: Ancient Sword Dao. Ancient Sword Dao is the first stage, the glory of unparalleled under the heavens sword. The Sword Saint, who was hosting the unparalleled under the heavens sword venerables assembly, glanced at the 10,000 sword venerables and said faintly, "Entering the ancient sword Dao, the glory of unparalleled under the heavens sword will depend on your own attainments in swordsmanship." The Sword Saint added. Chu Mu's heart skipped a beat. In terms of overall strength, he didn't have any advantage among the 10,000 sword venerables, but in terms of swordsmanship, he had never been afraid of anyone. Although no sword venerables spoke, each of them felt that they had the chance to obtain the glory of unparalleled under the heavens sword. "Open!" The Sword Saint pointed, and the bronze gate emitted a heavy and ancient creaking sound as it slowly opened, revealing endless darkness. "You can enter now." The Sword Saint retracted his finger and said faintly. He did not give any introduction to the ancient sword Dao. Everything could only be explored by oneself. To be able to cultivate to such a level, these sword venerables were all very determined. They stepped forward without hesitation and walked into the ancient sword Dao that was like a black hole. They disappeared as if they were being devoured. Chu Mu also walked into the ancient sword path. His vision darkened, and then a faint light appeared. It was dim. Chu Mu's vision sword seemed to have lost its function. He couldn't see anything around him clearly. It was like an ordinary person at dawn. They could vaguely see that this was a tunnel, but they didn't know where it led. A strange energy spiraled around him. Chu Mu realized that his sword origin and sword intent were all sealed. He couldn't use them for the time being. Even the power of the sky desolate sword physique was sealed. He only had the strength of an ordinary astral realm swordsman. The glory of unparalleled sword arts. It seems like the ancient sword path is completely dependent on sword arts, he thought to himself as his pupils suddenly shrank. Unknowingly, a figure walked out of the darkness and stood a few meters in front of Chu Mu. He didn't say a word and didn't move. His aura condensed, and traces of sharpness surrounded him, blocking Chu Mu's path. It seemed that if he wanted to continue, he would have to defeat this person. He couldn't see his face clearly, but he gave Chu Mu a sense of familiarity. It was as if he had seen this person before. With a clang, a cold light flashed in the darkness. The person drew his sword, and the cold sword light spread in all directions. It was very dazzling. The sword light was unsheathed, and a cold and sharp aura spread out. It turned into a breeze and blew towards Chu Mu. Chu Mu only saw a flash in front of his eyes. The dazzling sword light was like an aurora cutting through the sky. It instantly approached him, and went straight for his throat, aiming to kill him in one strike. This strike completely grasped the speed, accuracy, steadiness, and viciousness of sword arts. It was at the level of a sword master. Chu Mu didn't move. It was only when the sharp sword light was close to his throat that he took a step forward. Vaguely, he seemed to hear a clang, and 2 figures crossed each other. Chu Mu's sword was still in the sheath. He didn't stop and continued to walk forward. However, the figure stopped after taking 3 steps forward, and his head rolled backwards. Killed in one strike. 10,000 sword venerables entered the ancient sword path together, but they seemed to have been separated. Each sword venerable took a different path and encountered opponents of the same level of sword art. To these 10,000 sword venerables, master-level sword arts attainments weren't difficult at all. They easily killed their opponents and continued to move forward. The second opponent's sword arts were more profound than the first. With Chu Mu's eyesight, he could distinguish even the slightest difference. Again, their figures crossed each other, and they were killed in one strike. Third opponent, fourth opponent, fifth opponent. There was no end to the ancient sword path. Chu Mu killed one opponent after another with a single strike, and he continued to move forward. The 10th opponent stood in front of Chu Mu. Chu Mu's intuition told him that this opponent's swordsmanship had improved significantly. However, Chu Mu didn't stop and kept walking forward at a steady pace. His opponent also stepped forward, but he didn't draw his sword. Only traces of sharp aura rose from his body, and it became more and more intense. When they were 3 meters apart, his opponent drew his sword and slashed. It seemed simple, but it gave Chu Mu a feeling that he couldn't dodge it. A sword master. If it was in the past, they might have to fight for a while to determine the winner. However, at this moment, Chu Mu just drew his sword, crossed each other, and cut off his opponent's head. It was an instant kill. At this level, the other sword venerables were no longer able to kill their opponents in one strike like before. Some of them had to fight for a few or even more than 10 strikes before they could kill their opponent. In any case, these 10,000 sword venerable swordsmanship had at least reached the level of a sword master. However, some of them were better than others. The 11th opponent's swordsmanship had improved a little, but he still couldn't block Chu Mu's strike. Even until now, Chu Mu hadn't shown his true strength in swordsmanship. Insta-kill, 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 all of them were insta-killed. On the other side of the ancient sword path, other than the original sword saint, another figure appeared. I wonder who will get the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship this time? The sword saint who had just appeared said casually. Wait for the result. The sword saint who was in charge of the ancient sword path replied faintly. Speaking of which, these little guys must have been very surprised when they found out that the unparalleled sword venerable meeting was divided into 3 segments, the sword saint said with an amused expression. He seemed to have the personality of an old child. You know the purpose of holding the unparalleled sword venerable meeting. It can't only be based on overall strength. Among them, there are some who have reached the level of ultimate sword venerable, but their potential has basically been exhausted. Even if they get some opportunities to break through, it will be difficult for them to advance to a higher level in the future. Therefore, temporary strength doesn't count. Talent and potential are the key, the sword saint of the ancient sword path said faintly. Speaking of which, I wonder what will happen to these 10,000 people after they go there. The somewhat childish sword saint said with a serious expression. I don't know. The sword saint of the ancient sword path was silent for a while before he replied indifferently. At this moment, figures flashed in the surrounding open space. They were the sword venerables who had entered the ancient sword path before. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of sword venerables appeared and looked around. Didn't I get killed? Where is this? These sword venerables clearly hadn't reacted yet. They only reacted when they saw the 2 sword saints. Death in the ancient sword path wasn't real death, but failure. They couldn't continue to challenge the ancient sword path, which meant that they had nothing to do with the glory of the unparalleled sword path. Even though they were unwilling, there was nothing they could do about it. After all, their attainments in sword skills were only at that level. As a swordsman, although sword skills were important, they usually didn't put them at the top of their list. This was because sword skills were often required to kill other swordsmen or demonic beasts in a battle. The attainments in sword skills had nothing to do with sword skills. It was impossible for them to spend a lot of time on sword skills. However, some swordsmen were more talented in sword skills. If they spent the same amount of time, their attainments in sword skills would be higher. Therefore, most of the sword venerables were still challenging the ancient sword path. However, as their opponents became stronger and their attainments in sword skills became higher and higher, more and more sword venerables were defeated and appeared on the open space. In just a few dozen breaths, more than 5,000 sword venerables were defeated. The 16th opponent. This opponent's attainments in sword skills were very strong. Thousands of sword venerables had been defeated by an opponent of this level. However, this opponent was still killed by Chu Mu in a second. The 17th opponent. In the open space outside the ancient sword path, more than 9,000 sword venerables appeared. They had all been defeated. There were still more than 300 sword venerables who were challenging the ancient sword path. The 18th opponent. Many sword venerables were defeated again because this opponent's sword skills were already very strong. At the moment, there were only 10 sword venerables who were still challenging the ancient sword path. Everything in the ancient sword path couldn't be seen except for the sword saints who were in charge of the ancient sword path. Therefore, no one knew how powerful the opponents that the 10 sword venerables would encounter next would be. The 19th opponent. As soon as this opponent appeared, Chu Mu had a strange feeling. The opponent directly walked over, step by step, and slowly pulled out his sword. He didn't seem to be accumulating strength, but he directly stabbed at Chu Mu with his sword. Before the sword arrived, a wisp of coldness and sharpness had already locked onto Chu Mu, as if it wanted to penetrate Chu Mu's body. The word sharpness was vividly displayed. Chu Mu instantly determined that this opponent's sword technique attainments had already reached the peak of sword technique grandmaster. This was the limit. Within this level, it was impossible to increase any further unless one broke into the sword technique domain. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:11. A sword light shone in all directions, causing the darkness to recede. It was like a meteor breaking through the sky, like a thunderbolt. Vaguely, Chu Mu felt that within a 10-meter radius of his opponent, there seemed to be a strange power. Chu Mu was very familiar with it. It was not the power of a domain, but the power of the forbidden zone of swordsmanship. Although it is very strong, it is still not enough, Chu Mu said to himself. He took a step forward and pulled out his sword. The sword light flashed past like a heavenly steed. The meteor shattered and the thunderbolt disappeared. The opponent's figure stopped, swayed, and fell forward. One sword kill. On the other ancient sword paths, a sword venerable attacked. His swordsmanship seemed to be wide open, but it was delicate and detailed. One sword contained thousands of changes, and it was difficult to predict where the sword would land. This sword venerable fought with his opponent. After 3 swords, he seized the opportunity to kill his opponent and continued to move forward. The other 8 sword venerables went through a tough battle. One of them was lucky enough to kill his opponent, but his left arm was cut off and he was seriously injured. It was basically certain that he could not compete with the next opponent. The other 7 sword venerables were defeated and sent out of the ancient sword path. The 20th opponent appeared. If I am not wrong, this opponent should have mastered the domain of swordsmanship. But I wonder what level he has mastered? Chu Mu was finally interested. There was a trace of fire in his heart. He had fought with Sky Dragon Sword Saint in the Sword Palace and his swordsmanship had broken through to the domain of swordsmanship. After that, he refined and stabilized at the first level of the domain of swordsmanship. His swordsmanship had improved by leaps and bounds. Since then, as he cultivated and comprehended, his swordsmanship had become more and more profound. Until now, due to the lack of suitable opponents, Chu Mu did not know what level his swordsmanship had reached. In the ancient sword path, one would encounter one opponent after another. Each opponent would only use swordsmanship, and the further one went, the more profound the opponent's swordsmanship would be. Moreover, being killed here did not mean death. One could completely let go and fight with all their strength. Such an opportunity was hard to come by. Chu Mu would definitely not let it go. His footsteps suddenly quickened as he unsheathed his sword and slashed out. Unsheathing a sword was also a form of attack. Chu Mu's sword tore through the air like a lightning bolt. His opponent's body flashed as he used the smallest body possible to avoid this sword attack. He then counterattacked with his sword. A strange power wrapped around the sword, affecting the surrounding space and causing Chu Mu's sword attack to be pulled in. Sword technique domain power. Chu Mu's eyes lit up. His wrist shook slightly, and the trajectory of the sword changed. It followed the direction of the opponent's swordsmanship domain and drew a slight arc, instantly sweeping past the opponent's neck. It was a close call. His opponent's neck was slightly tilted back, and Chu Mu's sword cut through his skin, but he was not seriously injured. If he could add sword intent and sword origin to this sword, it would be enough to kill his opponent instantly. Unfortunately, it was just a simple sword technique without using the power of the sword technique domain, so it was unable to kill his opponent. Chu Mu was slightly surprised by his opponent's quick reaction. His sword did not stop. With a shake of his wrist, the tip of the sword trembled slightly and instantly drew out several sword shadows. It was impossible to predict where the tip of the sword would land. His opponent raised his sword slowly. The power of the sword technique domain once again pulled Chu Mu's sword, causing the tip of the sword to deviate. Die! With a light shout, Chu Mu's sword slashed forward. When his opponent dodged again, it pierced through his throat and killed him. Chu Mu did not immediately move forward. He stood in place and replayed the battle just now in his mind. This opponent's swordsmanship has indeed reached the domain realm, but it is only at the beginning. The power of the sword technique domain is thin and the traction is insufficient. It is not a threat to me. If I use the power of the sword technique domain, I can kill him instantly. As for the other two sword venerables, that was where they stopped. They were directly killed by their opponent. They could not resist the power of the sword technique domain at all. Chu Mu was the only one left in Ancient Sword Path. In the open space outside Ancient Sword Path, 9,999 sword venerables gathered. Who else hasn't come out? There seems to be one more person. Who is it? His swordsmanship is so powerful that he can make it to this stage. Tao Feng's face was a little gloomy. He had worked hard on his swordsmanship and also had a fortuitous encounter related to swordsmanship. Therefore, his swordsmanship was unfathomable and unparalleled. Ever since his swordsmanship became successful, there was no swordsman who could compete with him in terms of swordsmanship. Even those who were older than him could not compete with him in terms of swordsmanship. Therefore, he was vaguely crowned as the best swordsman in the younger generation. As time passed, Tao Feng defeated more and more opponents with his swordsmanship. He felt that his swordsmanship was the best among his peers. Tao Feng originally thought that it would be difficult for him to get a good ranking in the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly with his strength as a top sword venerable. He did not expect that the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly would have 3 segments and 3 unparalleled swordsmen. Ancient Sword Dao, the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship. In Tao Feng's opinion, it was already in his bag. He firmly believed that among the 10,000 sword venerables, there were many who were stronger than him. However, there was no one whose swordsmanship was comparable to his, not to mention those who were stronger than him. Even Ji Qingyu, who was currently recognized as one of the top 10 sword venerables, was not a match for his 10 swords in terms of swordsmanship alone. However, to Tao Feng's surprise, there was actually someone who lasted longer than him in the Ancient Sword Dao. This guy is probably standing on the same spot and not moving forward to stall for time. Tao Feng thought to himself. He felt that this was the only possibility. Otherwise, it was impossible for someone of his age to surpass him in swordsmanship. There was still one person who did not leave the Ancient Sword Dao. The sword venerables could only continue to wait. In the dim ancient sword Tao, sword light flickered. It was frighteningly cold, like the cold air of the nine nether abyss. It was extremely fierce and sharp. The two swords collided. The sword Tao domain confronted each other and cancelled each other out silently. Every sword was like a heavenly steed soaring in the sky. It was untraceable and contained great principles. The surrounding space was affected, pulled, distorted, and fluctuated. The two figures crossed each other in the narrow passageway. They instantly turned around and attacked with their swords. This was Chu Mu's 22nd opponent. The 21st opponent's sword Tao domain had just entered the first level. He was not a match for Chu Mu and was killed by Chu Mu. Now, the 22nd opponent's sword Tao domain had stabilized at the first level and was approaching the second level. In terms of level, he was above Chu Mu. The power of his sword Tao domain was stronger than Chu Mu's. However, Chu Mu was evenly matched with his opponent based on his own consciousness and the fusion of the sword Tao domain that he had observed. Chu Mu's sword was extremely fierce. In addition to the cold sword light, every sword seemed to contain traces of dark gold that tore through everything. Chu Mu was not in a hurry. He fought steadily, dodging, blocking, and counterattacking. Under such circumstances, he was constantly observing his opponent's sword Tao and absorbing its strengths bit by bit. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, 15 minutes had passed. Chu Mu had already figured out his opponent's sword Tao domain. Chu Mu had also absorbed its strengths one by one. However, in a short time, Chu Mu was still unable to completely transform and integrate it into his own body. Mountain quake energy die. The muscles all over his body instantly squirmed. A tyrannical force was transmitted and vibrated. The mountain quake energy was displayed and integrated into the sword Tao domain. This sword was biting cold and unstoppable. Even if it was a mountain, it would be split and shattered. As if the heavens were shining, the opponent only felt that the surrounding space was instantly sealed. There was no way for him to dodge. He burst out with all his strength, shouted, and raised his sword to block. The clanging sound was like the collision of divine iron from outer space, dull and heavy. The opponent's sword was broken in the middle. The sword fell straight to the ground. The terrifying mountain quake energy shattered the opponent's body. Chu Mu's body trembled. His face turned pale and blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. Without the strength of the Sky Desolation sword body, using the mountain quake energy with only the strength of a primary realm swordsman was a bit difficult. It seems like I won't be able to defeat the next opponent. However, it's good to experience it. Chu Mu took a few breaths to adjust himself and continued forward. The 23rd opponent. This opponent's sword Tao domain had already reached the second level, completely surpassing Chu Mu. If Chu Mu could keep using the mountain quake energy, he could fight with him. Unfortunately, the mountain quake energy was too much of a burden on the body. Chu Mu displayed his dual sword Tao and was killed after 30 moves with this opponent. In a flash, Chu Mu appeared in the open space outside the ancient sword Tao domain. He could feel many gazes landing on him as if they were about to pierce through him. He was truly the center of attention. Very good. Your sword Tao domain is indeed worthy of the unparalleled glory. The sword saint in charge of the ancient sword Tao domain smiled and nodded at Chu Mu. His tone was different from his usual cold and indifferent tone. Others couldn't know what was going on inside the ancient sword Tao domain. Only he, as the person in charge of the ancient sword Tao domain, could see the battle between Chu Mu and his opponent. At such a young age, such sword Tao domain was unparalleled in the world. I announce that the unparalleled glory in sword Tao domain belongs to Chu Mu. The sword saint announced loudly. When it reached the ears of every sword sovereign, they were shocked. The sword saint's announcement was equivalent to the 100 Saints Alliance's affirmation. Many sword sovereigns felt uncomfortable that an unknown sword sovereign had obtained the unparalleled glory. Even if they felt uncomfortable, they couldn't show it now. This was the 100 Saints Alliance's acknowledgement. If they showed it now, it would be embarrassing for the 100 Saints Alliance. On the ancient sword continent, who dared to embarrass the 100 Saints Alliance? Even if the top 10 sword Dao sects joined forces, they wouldn't dare. The first stage of the unparalleled Sword Sovereign Assembly has ended. You have 1 month to cultivate. After 1 month, the second stage will begin. The Sword Saint said and waved his hand, indicating for everyone to leave. He also left with another Sword Saint and disappeared. What's going on? There's no reward? The Sword Sovereigns were all stunned. Could it be that the champion of the ancient Sword Dao domain only received the title of Unparalleled Sword Dao domain, and there was no substantial reward? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:12. Chu Mu quickly returned to the Sword Tower. After resting for a while, he began to reflect on what he had gained from the ancient sword path. I have to investigate this Chu Mu. Where did he come from? How could he obtain the glory of the unparalleled swordsmanship? He's only at the peak of the origin realm, Deshang. How could such an insignificant person obtain the glory of the unparalleled swordsmanship? Among the 10,000 sword venerables, Chu Mu was indeed insignificant. Therefore, no one would deliberately investigate him. In fact, other than Chen Bu-er and Su Haoshao, the other sword venerables did not know Chu Mu at all. However, the ancient sword path and the unparalleled swordsmanship immediately made Chu Mu the focus of all the sword venerables. He was like a scorching sun that emitted endless rays of light. This is really interesting. I thought the unparalleled swordsmanship glory would appear among the top 10 sword venerables. Indeed, those who could be chosen as the top 10 sword venerables were not only powerful, but their swordsmanship was also very profound. Not necessarily. I thought Tao Feng would obtain this glory. Ji Qingyu said lightly, like a graceful young master. Tao Feng? The swordsman who defeated you in 10 moves? That's right. I didn't expect Tao Feng to be ranked second. The unparalleled swordsmanship glory would be obtained by a nobody. Ji Qingyu said. He felt that with Tao Feng's character, he would not let this matter go. There would be a good show to watch. A nobody? Right now, Chu Mu isn't a nameless person. In the Unparalleled Sword Conference, he has already obtained his first unparalleled honor. Even if he doesn't perform well in the next 2 stages, his name will be recorded in history. Soon, the information about Chu Mu was dug up. Born in a small family in the Great Kuan dynasty of the Eastern Sword Domain, Chu Mu's birth, growth, when he became a sword hero, what kind of experiences he had, when he entered the Central Sword Domain, and what he experienced in the Central Sword Domain were all very detailed. If Chu Mu was here, he would be very surprised. It could be said that other than the secret of the soul crossing and merging, everything else was clearly investigated. I didn't expect Brother Chu's background to be so low. Although Su Haoshao knew Chu Mu and had some friendship with him, he didn't know about Chu Mu's background. Now that he saw the information, he was shocked. In terms of background, Chu Mu and him were worlds apart, but in terms of achievements, Chu Mu was above him. Back then, when he was Chu Mu's age, he didn't have Chu Mu's strength at all. He couldn't compare at all. Su Haoshao wasn't the only one who was surprised. All the sword sovereigns who saw the information were shocked. Even the sword saint in charge of the ancient sword Dao was shocked. Genius, a true genius. Such a genius has a greater chance of becoming a sword saint in the future. Only those who had already become sword saints or those who were stuck at the limit of the sword of Gojoseon knew how difficult it was to become a sword saint. His swordsmanship is unparalleled. Let's see what kind of results he can achieve in the second stage of the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Tournament. Inside a sword tower, Tao Feng's face was gloomy. He threw the information in his hand onto the floor and stood up abruptly. Only I have the right to obtain unparalleled swordsmanship. As if he was talking to himself, Tao Fong strode down the stairs and walked out of the sword tower. This was his obsession. For more than 10 years, many people thought that his swordsmanship was unfathomable and unparalleled among his peers. Even many of the older generation swordsmen couldn't be compared to him. Tao Fong had always been proud of this. Tao Fong could accept that he was inferior to others in other aspects, but in terms of swordsmanship, he had to be number one. Outside Chu Mu's sword tower, a person appeared. It was Tao Fong. Tao Fong went to Chu Mu's sword tower. It seems like there will be a good show to watch. After Ji Qingyu received the news, a smile appeared on his face. Other than Ji Qingyu, other sword sovereigns also received the news. After thinking for a while, they felt that something might happen. Therefore, one by one, they left the sword tower and headed to Chu Mu's sword tower. Everyone knew that Chu Mu had obtained the unparalleled swordsmanship glory. Naturally, the sword tower he lived in was also remembered by the sword sovereigns. Tao Fong ignored the swordsmen from the other sword towers and stared at Chu Mu's sword tower with a gloomy expression. Suddenly, he attacked the seal. Layers of ripples spread out and alarmed Chu Mu, who was inside the sword tower. Someone is attacking the sword tower. Chu Mu stood up and saw hundreds of sword sovereigns gathered outside. There were even more sword sovereigns rushing over. He didn't know what was going on and walked out of the seal. Chu Mu, draw your sword and fight with me. I want you to know that only I have the right to obtain the unparalleled swordsmanship glory. Tao Fong said coldly. You don't have to tell me whether I have the right or not. Go and find the 100 Saints Alliance. Chu Mu replied indifferently, ignoring Tao Fong. Gu Jiandao had already shown the truth. In terms of swordsmanship, Tao Fong was no match for him. Turning around, Chu Mu was about to walk into the seal when he suddenly sensed danger. He quickly dodged to the side and saw a sword light slashing down. The sword light exploded on the seal and created many ripples. If this sword hit, he wouldn't die, but he would definitely be injured. Tao Fong held the sword in his right hand and stared at Chu Mu fiercely, as if he wouldn't give up. Since you want to fight, I'll fight with you. Chu Mu was annoyed and his tone became indifferent. Very well, let's go to the arena. Tao Fong said, not caring about Chu Mu's tone. In the sword tower where the sword sovereigns of the Unparalleled Sword Sovereign Association lived, there were a few arenas built for the sword sovereigns to spar. Very quickly, everyone came to the closest sword fighting stage. Chu Mu and Tao Fong stood on the sword fighting stage. Below the sword fighting stage, there were several thousand sword sovereigns. It seems like Tao Fong isn't satisfied with his second place, so he challenged Chu Mu. Chu Mu's sword skill must be very profound to be able to obtain the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship. Tao Fong's action is just asking for humiliation. Chu Mu, I will defeat you with my swordsmanship. I will let you know that only I am qualified to obtain the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship. Tao Fong pointed his sword at Chu Mu and his voice resounded in everyone's ears. No need to boast. Chu Mu said indifferently and walked towards Tao Fong step by step. You'll know soon enough whether I'm boasting or not. Tao Fong retorted and stopped talking. His eyes flickered with sharp light as he stared at Chu Mu. Every step Chu Mu took was reflected in his eyes. Since it was a competition of swordsmanship, Tao Fong obviously couldn't use sword origin, sword intent, or profound. He adjusted his body and squinted his eyes, looking for the best time to attack. Chu Mu constantly neared. In Tao Fong's eyes, Chu Mu's left foot was lifted up, stepped forward, and was about to land again. The moment his foot was about to touch the ground, Tao Fong's eyes widened and a terrifying light shot out like cold lightning. He let out a low roar and his body swayed. He charged forward and lifted his sword to stab out. This sword was like a bolt of lightning that tore through the sky, piercing towards Chu Mu's shoulder with the shortest path and the fastest speed. It was earth-shattering. Once it hit, Chu Mu's shoulder would definitely be injured. What a fast sword! No wonder he dares to challenge the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship. The onlooking sword sovereigns were all shocked. With their eyesight, they could naturally see the exquisiteness and power of this sword move. If it were them, they wouldn't be able to resist it at all. How is he going to deal with it? Some sword sovereigns had doubts in their hearts. At the same time, they felt that Chu Mu should dodge. Facing Tao Fang's extremely fast and fierce sword move, Chu Mu's expression didn't change. It was as if he didn't see it. His left foot still landed on the ground, and he pulled out his sword at the same time. When the eight-sided sky desolate sword came out of its sheath, the onlookers only saw a blurry sword light like an aurora breaking through the sky at an even faster speed. In an instant, an indescribable sword light flashed past. Chu Mu and Tao Fang's figures crossed each other's. Sheathing his sword, Chu Mu didn't even look at Tao Fang. He walked down the arena and left without looking back. Tao Fang stood on the arena, his hand holding the sword trembling. There was a sword hole in his shoulder, blood dripping down his arm and onto his sword. One sword move. He defeated Tao Fang with just one sword move. The sword sovereigns sucked in a breath of cold air. In their eyes, Tao Fang's swordsmanship was already terrifying. Even the top 10 sword sovereigns had a dignified expression, admitting that they couldn't compare. But Chu Mu's swordsmanship made them feel horrified. They didn't have the slightest chance of resisting. If they met Chu Mu in a situation where they could only use their swordsmanship, only death would await them. Worthy of the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship. Tao Fang's face was pale. Sweat seeped from his forehead. His eyes were gray and there was a trace of despair in them. Compared to the injury on his shoulder, being defeated by Chu Mu in one sword move was a bigger blow to him. It turned out that the swordsmanship he was so proud of was nothing in front of Chu Mu. They were two completely different existences, like the gap between heaven and earth. No one cared about Tao Fang and no one pitied him. Everyone could see that if Chu Mu couldn't block or avoid that sword move, his shoulder would be pierced by Tao Fang. Therefore, Tao Fang's shoulder injury was just Chu Mu's repayment. Fortunately, he didn't use sword origin or profound sword intent. With the help of elixirs, this kind of injury would only take a few days to heal. He's really strong. Su Haoshao exhaled. The glory of unparalleled swordsmanship wasn't enough to describe Chu Mu's swordsmanship. Only by witnessing it with one's own eyes could one understand how terrifying and unpredictable his swordsmanship was. What a pity! If only he had the strength of an ultimate sword sovereign. Some battle maniacs who had the strength of an ultimate sword sovereign said secretly. If that was the case, they would have one more powerful and terrifying opponent. There was nothing more exciting than this. This kind of swordsmanship, even I am shocked. A sword saint said secretly. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:13. Defeating Tao Fang in one strike had made Chu Mu even more famous. Unparalleled sword art glory was well deserved. No one doubted or disagreed with him. A month passed peacefully. Within this month, Chu Mu's sword art had improved again. He was even closer to the second level of the sword art domain. His cultivation was still stuck at the peak of the origin realm. Deshang had reached the bottleneck. His sword intent and other aspects had also improved. The second stage of the unparalleled sword master gathering had begun. In front of the 10,000 sword masters was a palace. Above the closed door of the palace, there was a plaque with 3 words written on it: Futu Palace. Within the Futu Palace, there is a Futu for you to comprehend. The more you comprehend, the first place will receive the glory of unparalleled comprehension. The manager of the Futu Palace was also a sword saint. As he spoke, his gaze swept across the 10,000 sword masters and landed on Chu Mu's face. 100 Saints Alliance's sword saints all recognized Chu Mu due to his unparalleled sword technique. So the second stage is a competition of comprehension. The sword masters were enlightened. Oh no, my comprehension is not outstanding. This time I will not be able to get first place. Some of the sword masters who knew their limits were depressed. The glory of peerless perception belongs to me this time. Some of the sword venerables who were very confident in their perception whispered to themselves. Their faces were full of divine light. However, among the 10,000 sword masters, there were quite a few who believed that their comprehension was outstanding, who would be able to obtain the glory of unparalleled comprehension in the end. The sword saint of the Futu Palace waved his sleeve. The door of the Futu Palace opened and a mysterious aura spread out. Go in. The sword saint of the Futu Palace said lightly. The 10,000 sword masters moved and quickly entered through the door. The Futu Palace was infinitely large. In front of each of the 10,000 sword masters was a Futu. Beside the Futu, there was an hourglass that began to let out silver sand. Comprehension, comprehension. It should be to comprehend the Futu in front of us. The sword masters looked at the hourglass beside them. They either stood or sat down cross-legged. Staring at the Futu in front of them, they cleared their thoughts and started to comprehend. If he guessed correctly, the hourglass beside him was a time-limited item. Once the silver sand in the hourglass ran out, if one still hadn't fully comprehended the mysteries of the stupa in front of him, it would mean that he had failed. The silver sand slowly fell, neither fast nor slow. About 1/10 of the silver hourglass was gone. Hundreds of sword venerables' bodies emitted white light and disappeared in the next breath. Just as the hundreds of sword venerables disappeared, another 1,000 sword venerables emitted white light and disappeared as well. In just 3 breaths of time, more than 5,000 sword venerables had disappeared. The other sword venerables were trying their best to comprehend the sword Tao, and more people were disappearing. When the silver hourglass was half empty, there was not a single honorable swordsman left on the first level of the stupa palace. Everyone had entered the second level. The level of comprehension was also relative. These 10,000 sword venerables stood out from hundreds of thousands of other sword venerables. They were definitely the pinnacle of sword venerables in the ancient sword continent. Their strength was extraordinary, and to be able to reach their current level, other than their fortuitous encounters and hard work, they also had outstanding comprehension. However, among these 10,000 sword venerables, some had higher comprehension, while others had lower comprehension. Naturally, those with higher comprehension would comprehend faster, while those with lower comprehension would comprehend slower. The Futu in the first level of Stupa Palace was not difficult to comprehend. The second level of Stupa Palace also had 10,000 Futu and 10,000 hourglasses. The 10,000 sword venerables were either standing or sitting in front of the Futu to comprehend. When they first entered the first level, the sword venerables had not fully entered the state of comprehension. After the first level's buffer, the sword venerables immediately entered the state of comprehension upon entering the second level. About 1/10 of the silver sand in the hourglass fell. Another 100 sword venerables were enveloped by the white light and disappeared in an instant. It was almost the same. Stupa Palace's third level. Stupa Palace's fourth level. Stupa Palace's fifth level. At this level, the Futu was even more complex and mysterious. The difficulty of comprehending it was obviously higher. The comprehension of these 10,000 sword venerables was beginning to show. When 1/5 of the silver sand in the hourglass fell, the bodies of the 10 sword venerables emitted a white light and disappeared. If one were to look closely, they would notice that there were differences in the amount of time that the sword venerables disappeared. It was just that the differences were too minute and looked the same. About 3,000 sword venerables succeeded in comprehending the Futu and entered the sixth level of Stupa Palace. The remaining sword venerables remained on the fifth level. The silver sand in the hourglass fell bit by bit, and time was running out. There was no time to rush. Everyone held their breaths and focused on comprehending. When the last bit of silver sand landed, among the 7,000 or so sword venerables, another few hundred sword venerables glowed with white light as they successfully entered the 6th level. The other sword venerables glowed with black light as they disappeared. In the blink of an eye, more than 6,000 sword venerables appeared outside Stupa Palace. On the 6th level of Stupa Palace, more than 3,000 sword venerables corresponded to more than 3,000 foot. Time passed slowly. The silver sand in the hourglass fell slowly. Not long later, half of the sand had fallen. More than a dozen sword venerables emitted a white light. Following that, another few dozen sword venerables emitted a white light and disappeared in a flash. On the 6th level of Stupa Palace, more than 2,000 sword venerables failed and were sent out of Stupa Palace. On the 7th level of Stupa Palace, more than 1,000 sword venerables continued to comprehend. No one spoke because they all knew that time was of the essence. The Futu was getting more and more complex, and the difficulty was getting higher. If they were to miss a little bit of time and fail, they would feel like dying. Stupa Palace's 8th level. More than 800 sword venerables were eliminated. Stupa Palace's 9th level. More than 400 sword venerables were eliminated. Stupa Palace's 10th level. 63 sword venerables were eliminated. On the 11th level of Stupa Palace, only 13 sword venerables entered. The 11th level was not much different from the previous 10 levels. It was just that the Futu was more complex and profound. The hourglass on one side was twice as big. The speed of the falling silver sand did not change, which meant that the time taken to comprehend the Futu was twice as long. With a quick glance, the 13 sword venerables saw each other clearly. When they saw Chu Mu, they were shocked but soon felt relieved. That's right, at such a young age, his sword skills were so outstanding. If he did not have a high level of comprehension, he would not have been able to achieve it. In the beginning, the cultivation of sword skills relied on hard work. But after reaching a certain level, it was hard to make any significant progress just by hard work. When one reached a bottleneck, even if one trained hard for months or years, they would not be able to make any progress. At this point, one had to rely on comprehension. In order to comprehend, one had to have a high enough level of comprehension. The higher the level of comprehension, the faster one could comprehend. Chu Mu's sword skills were so shocking, his comprehension must be very high as well. It was only natural that the other 12 sword venerables were no longer surprised. They cast aside this fleeting thought and stared at the Futu in front of them. They entered a state of comprehension and focused on comprehending. Chu Mu also saw the 12 sword venerables clearly. They were the top 10 sword venerables. Other than that, there were 2 sword venerables that he did not recognize. They looked to be in their 30s. Perhaps in the past, these 2 sword venerables were not so famous. But after this, regardless of whether they could obtain the glory of unparalleled comprehension, their names would definitely spread far and wide. This was because they were 2 of the 13 sword venerables who could enter the 11th level of the Futu Palace out of 10,000 sword venerables. Chu Mu stared at the Futu in front of him. The patterns on the Futu were very complicated. After careful observation and comprehension, a similar image appeared in Chu Mu's spiritual world. It was just that it was very blurry. As he comprehended, the Futu pattern in his spiritual world became clearer bit by bit. Finally, the outline appeared, but the patterns on it were still very blurry. This method of comprehension was very direct. As long as the Futu was clearly displayed in his spiritual world, it would be equivalent to a successful comprehension. Lines and lines appeared on the Futu in his spiritual world. The silver sand in the hourglass beside him fell slowly. Time passed slowly, and the 11th level was silent. "It's done," he muttered to himself. The last pattern was formed, and the Futu in his spiritual world became clear. It was exactly the same as the Futu outside. There was no difference at all. It was as if the Futu had been directly transferred into his spiritual world. Chu Mu's body emitted a white light, which immediately alerted the other sword venerables. In the next moment Chu Mu disappeared. Immediately after, another sword venerables emitted a white light and entered the 12th level of the Futu Palace after Chu Mu. Not long after, the third sword venerables also emitted a white light and entered the 12th level of the Futu Palace. Brother Chu Mu, you took the glory of unparalleled swordsmanship. This time, you can't be thinking of taking the glory of unparalleled comprehension, right? Su Haosha looked at Chu Mu and laughed. Currently, only 3 sword venerables had entered the 12th level. However, because the comprehension of the 11th level was still ongoing, the comprehension of the 12th level had not started yet. The Futu had not appeared yet. I have such a plan. Chu Mu smiled faintly and said. Arrogant. The other sword venerables glared at Chu Mu and snorted. Chu Mu recognized him. He was one of the Sword Saint's 10 experts, Lai Shanhu. He was tall and strong, and his eyes were like a tiger's. He was extremely imposing, and those with weaker willpower would feel a lack of confidence when stared at by these eyes. Unfortunately, Chu Mu's willpower was strong and unshakable. He was not afraid of Lai Shanhu's stare. The glory of unparalleled comprehension will be mine, Lai Shanhu said again and shut his mouth. At this time, another figure appeared on the 12th level. It was one of the 2 sword venerables that Chu Mu did not recognize. This sword venerables had a cold expression on his face. He swept a glance at Chu Mu's group and ignored them. After a while, 4 Futu palaces appeared in front of the 4 sword venerables. Beside them, an hourglass appeared. On the 11th level of the Futu Palace, a total of 9 sword venerables were eliminated. Only 4 sword venerables succeeded and entered the 12th level to continue their comprehension. The Futu Palace's 12th level's Futu Palace was twice as complex and mysterious as the one on the 11th level. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:14. The Buddha was like an ancient beast, exerting immense pressure on the 4 sword venerables. If one's spiritual consciousness was not strong enough, it would be difficult to resist the aura of the Buddha. However, the 4 sword venerables had strong spiritual consciousnesses. While resisting the powerful aura of the Buddha, they were still able to focus their minds and comprehend. In the spiritual world, a blurry outline began to appear. Perhaps, at this stage, the victor between them would be decided. On the 12th floor of the Buddha Palace. This Chu Mu is full of surprises. How surprising! The Buddha Palace Sword Saint closed his eyes and sensed everything in the Buddha Palace. He was instantly shocked. Obtaining the unparalleled swordsmanship glory was enough to show that Chu Mu's comprehension was extraordinary. However, this did not mean that Chu Mu would be able to obtain the unparalleled swordsmanship glory. At this moment, Chu Mu was one of the 4 sword venerables who could enter the 12th floor of the Buddha Palace. This was enough to show that his comprehension was in the top 4 among the 10,000 sword venerables. As for where he would be ranked, it was hard to say. Perhaps he would be 4th, 3rd, 2nd, or even 1st. If this little guy also obtains the unparalleled swordsmanship glory. The Buddha Palace Sword Saint thought of this, and revealed a look of interest. The unparalleled sword venerable meeting had a total of 3 stages. In theory, 3 people would obtain the unparalleled swordsmanship glory. Of course, there were exceptions. For example, one person could obtain 2 or 3 unparalleled swordsmanship glory. Based on the current situation, it was impossible for one person to obtain 3 unparalleled swordsmanship glory. This was because the first unparalleled swordsmanship glory had already been obtained by Chu Mu. Furthermore, Chu Mu's strength was not yet at the level of a top sword venerable. It was impossible for him to obtain the unparalleled swordsmanship glory in the final stage. Little guy, I hope you can do something amazing again, the Buddha Palace Sword Saint thought to himself as the smile on his face faded. Outside the Buddha Palace, more than 9,000 sword venerables continued to wait. On the 12th floor of the Buddha Palace, Chu Mu and the other 3 sword venerables were immersed in their comprehension. The outline of the Buddha in the spiritual world had already appeared. The patterns on it had also begun to appear. However, due to the complexity of the patterns, the speed at which they appeared was very slow. What Chu Mu didn't know was that the pagoda patterns in the spiritual worlds of the other 3 sword venerables were appearing at a slower speed than his. In terms of swordsmanship, Chu Mu had never been afraid of anyone. In terms of comprehension, he had never been afraid of anyone. The fusion of 2 souls was not an increase of 1 + 1 = 2. Rather, it was an increase of several times. As one cultivated, as one's strength and will grew stronger, the potential of one's soul would be unlocked and one's perception would also grow stronger. Compared to the other swordsmen, Chu Mu's soul was much more powerful, and his potential was astonishing. Every time he developed his comprehension ability, he would be able to surpass the others. Half of the sand in the hourglass had already fallen. The 4 honorable swordsmen were comprehending with all their might without any distracting thoughts. Under such circumstances, they did not dare to be distracted. One by one, the patterns appeared on the outline of the pagoda, as if an invisible brush had been drawn on it. In the hourglass, the last grain of sand fell. In Chu Mu's spiritual world, the last pattern was successfully drawn. The entire pagoda became clear and lifelike. It released a ray of white light that instantly enveloped Chu Mu from the inside out. When the last grain of sand fell to the bottom of the hourglass, Chu Mu's figure disappeared. Su Haoshao, Lai Shanhu, and that unknown sword venerable were all wrapped up by the black light. This little guy is really... The sword saint of Pagoda Palace felt the changes in Pagoda Palace and was instantly shocked. It's him again. Lai Shanhu looked at the many sword venerables around him and knew that he had been sent out of Pagoda Palace. He had failed to comprehend the pagoda, but he did not see Chu Mu come out. This meant that Chu Mu had succeeded and entered the 13th level of Pagoda Palace. Among the 10,000 sword venerables, only one person had entered the 13th level. Without a doubt, the glory of unparalleled comprehension had been obtained by Chu Mu and belonged to him. Chu Mu is really... Su Haosha shook his head and smiled bitterly. He did not know how to describe Chu Mu. He felt that he had underestimated Chu Mu. With such swordsmanship and comprehension, given 2 or 3 years, he might surpass me. Chen Buer, Huangfu Huangtian, Shangguan Qinin, and the others who knew Chu Mu were also extremely shocked. One had to know that they had failed to comprehend the pagoda on the 6th level of Pagoda Palace. They could not be compared to Chu Mu. They were both happy and disappointed, especially Huangfu Huangtian. He was proud and arrogant, so it was hard for him to accept that he had encountered so many sword venerables at once. Many of them were above him. Now Chu Mu, a sword venerable who was younger than him by more than 10 years, had actually left him far behind twice. The feeling in his heart was indescribable. Time passed slowly and the surroundings were silent. Everyone knew that the glory of unparalleled comprehension belonged to someone. At this moment they felt as if they were in a dream. After 15 minutes, Chu Mu appeared. In the end, he was still unable to comprehend the pagoda on the 13th level of Pagoda Palace. He had only comprehended 2/3 of the pagoda before the time limit was up. Chu Mu also knew the limits of his current comprehension. Chu Mu, congratulations on obtaining the glory of unparalleled comprehension. The Pagoda Palace Sword Saint smiled from the bottom of his heart. 2 titles of unparalleled comprehension landed on Chu Mu's head. In an instant, Chu Mu's radiance was so dazzling that no one dared to look directly at him. All right, the second stage of the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly has ended. You all still have 1 month. After 1 month, The third stage of the unparalleled sword venerable assembly will begin. Prepare well. The Pagoda Palace Sword Saint smiled faintly. Then, he looked at Chu Mu and transmitted a message to Chu Mu through Sword Chi. Little guy, make good use of this 1 month and work hard to increase your strength. The Pagoda Palace closed and the Pagoda Palace Sword Saint left. Chu Mu and the other 10,000 sword venerables also left. The Pagoda Palace Sword Saint's message made Chu Mu feel strange. There seemed to be another meaning behind it. He quickly returned to the Sword Tower and declined all visitors. He directly entered the 3rd level of the Sword Tower and began to cultivate. After 15 minutes, Chu Mu discovered that his cultivation speed had not changed at all. He switched to comprehending sword intent. Once he started comprehending, there was no difference from before. When he switched to comprehending profound, Chu Mu was shocked to discover that his speed of comprehending profound had increased by 10 times. Could it be that entering the Pagoda Palace also increases the speed of one's comprehension of profound? Chu Mu guessed. He didn't know if it was the same for the other sword venerables or if it was just for him. In any case, the benefits were very tangible. He didn't know how long this state could last. Chu Mu cleared all distracting thoughts and focused on comprehending profound. He didn't dare to waste any time. Although the 10 times increase in comprehension speed couldn't be compared to the Enlightenment Pagoda in the sacred city of the Wildlands or the Myriad Origin Palace, it was still very obvious. Chu Mu's comprehension ability was already very shocking. His speed of comprehending profound was even higher than the other sword venerables. Now that his comprehension speed had increased by 10 times, it was even more shocking. From time to time, there would be sword venerables outside Chu Mu's sword tower. Their motive was very simple. They were here to build a relationship with Chu Mu. The glory of unparalleled swordsmanship and unparalleled comprehension ability. Although Chu Mu wasn't very strong now, his future was limitless. One had to know that he was only around 30 years old. If he didn't die, Chu Mu would definitely become an expert in the future. Only a person whose head was kicked by a pig wouldn't want to make friends with such a future expert. As for cultivation talent, although it was very important, the 100 Saints Alliance would definitely attach great importance to Chu Mu's current performance. There would definitely be treasures that could increase Chu Mu's cultivation talent by 1 grade. At that time, Chu Mu would definitely become an expert of the Sword of Gojoseon. Unfortunately, these sword venerables who wanted to befriend Chu Mu were all rejected. That was because Chu Mu hung a big sign on the sword tower, in seclusion, do not disturb. Since they wanted to befriend Chu Mu, they couldn't disturb his seclusion. Otherwise, they would be hated by the other party. In the blink of an eye, 10 days passed. Chu Mu's comprehension of the laceration profound had reached 75%. Unable to progress further, he switched to comprehending the void profound. The news that Chu Mu had obtained the glory of unparalleled comprehension ability once again spread in the 100 Saints Alliance. The Sword Saints of the 100 Saints Alliance were all very surprised. Another 10 days passed. His comprehension of the void profound had reached 45%. Encountering a bottleneck, Chu Mu didn't dare to waste time. He hastily switched to comprehending the water profound and the fire profound. Compared to the laceration profound and the void profound, the water profound and the fire profound were much easier to comprehend. It wasn't that difficult to comprehend both profound at the same time. Therefore, after another 10 days, Chu Mu's comprehension of the water profound and the fire profound had reached 76%. It was even higher than the laceration profound. At this point, the accelerated comprehension state had disappeared. Chu Mu was unable to continue comprehending the void profound. The void profound was now at 72%. Tomorrow is the 3rd stage of the unparalleled sword venerable assembly. Chu Mu stood up and stood on the 3rd floor of the sword tower. Looking at the pitch-black night sky through the window, he said faintly, "The first stage is sword arts, The second stage is comprehension ability. Then what will the third stage be? The other sword venerables had the same question as Chu Mu. They were all wondering what the third stage would be. Some sword venerables were even praying that the third stage would be the stage where they had the most advantage. Only then would they have the chance to compete for the unparalleled glory. However, the 100 Saints Alliance had done a very good job of keeping it a secret. Only the Sword Saints of the 100 Saints Alliance knew about it. The others didn't know about it. Now, my strength should be comparable to a top sword venerable. No matter what the purpose of the unparalleled sword venerable assembly is, at least it will allow my strength to increase rapidly in a short period of time. The third stage will begin when the sky brightens. I should take this opportunity to adjust my breathing and welcome the arrival of the third stage in my best state. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidyan.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:15. The third stage of the unparalleled sword venerable assembly had begun. Unlike the ancient sword sect's unparalleled sword arts and the Buddha Palace's unparalleled comprehension, the third stage was battle. The glory of unparalleled battle prowess. When the myriad battle palace's sword saint announced the content of the third stage, many sword venerables were disappointed, but there were also many who were happy. This was because the third stage was a battle between sword venerables. It was a battle of true strength, using strength to obtain the glory of unparalleled battle prowess. Humph, this time, you are not fated to be unparalleled. Many sword venerables stared at Chu Mu and muttered to themselves. The tallest tree in the forest would be destroyed by the wind. Chu Mu obtained 2 unparalleled battle prowess in one go and became the focus of attention. At the same time, he also became the target of jealousy in many people's hearts. They all knew that Chu Mu's true strength was between advanced sword venerable and pinnacle sword venerable. Among the 10,000 sword venerables, he was only at the middle level and was not outstanding at all. The Myriad Battle Palace was a special palace built by the 100 Saints Alliance for the battles between sword venerables. The Myriad Battle Palace had a special characteristic. The Myriad Battle Palace allowed the sword venerables to use their full strength, including secret techniques, to fight to the death with their opponents without any scruples. This was because the injuries and deaths in the Myriad Battle Palace were not real. After leaving the Myriad Battle Palace, everything would be recovered. The Myriad Battle Palace was so magical that it naturally consumed a lot of energy every time it was opened. The 100 Saints Alliance rarely opened the Myriad Battle Palace. This time, it was opened for the unparalleled Sword Venerable Assembly. When the 10,000 Sword Venerables walked into the Myriad Battle Palace, they immediately felt a strange aura fluctuation in the air. This aura fluctuation was not harmful to them. Each of the 10,000 sword venerables received a temporary seat. Each seat lit up with a gentle white light. The Myriad Battle Palace's sword saint was an old man with red hair that burned like flames. He gave off a feeling of anger. Getting close to him felt like getting close to an active volcano. The third stage of the unparalleled sword venerable assembly, the glory of unparalleled battle prowess. The first round begins now. The sword saint of the Myriad Battles Palace announced emotionlessly. Afterwards, white light shot out from 2 of the 10,000 seats, enveloping the sword venerables. In just a few seconds, the 2 sword venerables appeared on the circular platform at the very center of the Myriad Battles Palace. The platform was actually a semi-virtual realm. It covered a large area and was surrounded by powerful seals that could be activated depending on the situation. The current strength of the seals could withstand the attack of an ordinary sword of Gojoseon without breaking. The difference in strength between the sword venerable and the sword of Gojoseon was huge. No matter how strong the sword venerable was, his attack power could not reach the level of the sword of Gojoseon. The 2 sword venerables that entered the 10,000 battle platform were randomly selected, and it was all based on luck. Maybe their strength was similar, or maybe there was a huge difference in strength. For example, a high-level sword venerable would encounter an extreme-level sword venerable. The sword venerables in the other seats could see everything in the myriad battle platform clearly. Inside the myriad battle palace, there were many invisible divine senses that were watching everything. They were the other sword saints of the 100 Saints Alliance. Die. In the myriad battle platform, the two sword venerables unsheathed their swords and attacked each other without holding back. However, among these two sword venerables, one had the battle prowess of a pinnacle sword venerable, while the other only had the battle prowess of a high-rank sword venerable. The difference was very obvious. When the two sword skills collided, the high-rank sword venerable's sword skill was instantly defeated. While the high-rank sword venerable was trying to dodge, the pinnacle sword venerable suddenly appeared beside the high-rank sword venerable and sliced him in half. Whoosh! The two halves of the high-rank sword venerable turned into two rays of white light and disappeared. In the next breath, he appeared on his original seat. The white light on his seat dimmed like a lamp, indicating that he had been eliminated. The light on the winning sword venerable's seat was still as bright as before. After the first battle ended, about 10 breaths later, 2 more seats released rays of light. 2 sword venerables entered the myriad battle platform and started the second battle. There were victories and defeat. The victorious sword venerable could enter the next battle until he was defeated. After each battle, the next battle would take place after 10 breaths of time. Very quickly, dozens of battles had already passed. After 10 breaths of time, the seat in front of Chu Mu released a white light. Chu Mu couldn't dodge it and attacked Chu Mu. Immediately after, before Chu Mu could react, he had already appeared on the myriad battle platform. Opposite him was Chu Mu's opponent. When Chu Mu saw this, he was stunned. I said before that I would fight you within 10 years. Now, it's going to happen. Huangtian's tone was overbearing. His eyes were filled with battle intent. He unsheathed his sword and pointed it at Chu Mu. His overbearing aura surged out like a tidal wave and attacked Chu Mu. At this moment, it was as if he had transformed into the king of the world. Chu Mu and Huangtian should have an intense battle, Chen Bu-er said to himself. Chen Bu-er thought to himself. He felt that the combat strength of both sides should be about the same. A fierce battle was inevitable to determine the victor. Shangguan Qinin didn't know Chu Mu as well as Chen Bu-er, but her opinion was the same as Chen Bu-er's. Actually, it wasn't just the two of them. Many sword venerables had the same opinion. They all felt that Chu Mu and Huangtian would have an intense battle. Please, Chu Mu replied. He didn't unsheath his sword, but his aura was condensed and sharp. Take my move first, King's Fury. Huangtian roared and unsheathed his sword. It was as if he was the king of the world. Under this sword, it was as if the king wanted his subject to die. The subject had no choice but to die. His aura was unparalleled. If a swordsman with the same strength as Huangtian faced this sword, his aura would definitely weaken and he would be at a disadvantage. This sword gave Chu Mu a feeling that he couldn't dodge it. Million corpses. After unsheathing his sword, Huangtian followed up with a sword technique. He knew that Chu Mu's sword technique was unparalleled. If he fought against Chu Mu with sword techniques, he would definitely lose. He might even die under Chu Mu's sword in a few moves. He wouldn't even be able to unleash his full strength. Hence, the way to defeat Chu Mu was to attack with a powerful sword technique and kill Chu Mu with absolute battle prowess. King's Fury was like a prelude. The power of million corpses instantly increased by 30%. It was even more powerful than when it was used alone. High-level sword venerable. This sword technique revealed Huangtian's strength. Under million corpses, Chu Mu's body seemed to explode. Huangtian's expression changed as he had a bad feeling. It was as if the Chu Mu that was killed by million corpses was fake. As expected, Chu Mu appeared on the other side. He used the flying swan illusory steps under the ultimacy. It seemed real and fake at the same time, and Huang Tian couldn't tell. In less than a blink of an eye, Chu Mu appeared beside Huang Tian and slashed with his sword. Huang Tian immediately felt that there was a strange power on Chu Mu's sword. It wasn't sword origin, sword intent, or ultimacy. It was a special power that could affect the surrounding space. It pulled at his body, causing his reaction to be a beat slower. The sword slashed out, and the sword light was as cold as a cold star as it streaked across the sky. Huang Tian's head flew high into the air, and it tumbled in midair. His headless body also slowly fell forward. In the next moment, the flying head and headless body turned into two streaks of white light and left the myriad battle platform. They appeared on the seats, and the lights on the seats were extinguished at the same time. Huang Tian's expression was pale. Although he didn't really die in the myriad battle palace, the pain of having his head cut off was real. Thinking back to that pain and despair, he still had lingering fear. It made Huang Tian feel a chill on his neck, as if there was an invisible sword pressed against it. He needed some time to get rid of this psychological shadow. Compared to the pain of death, Huang Tian was more shocked that he had been killed by Chu Mu in a single strike. It turned out that the difference in strength between him and Chu Mu had unknowingly become so great. How laughable! He was still delusional to think that he could compete with Chu Mu and even defeat him. It turned out that it was just a fantasy. The other sword venerables were also shocked. The reality was different from what they had expected. There was no intense battle. It was just one strike, and Chu Mu had defeated Huang Tian without even using any sword technique. Although they were shocked, the battle still had to continue. After 10 breaths, the next battle continued. This Chu Mu's sword technique is really very profound. It's probably at a level that even I can't compare to. Very good battle talent. He grasped the timing very well. This was the Sword Saint's divine consciousness talking silently. Chu Mu didn't look happy at all after defeating Huang Tian in one strike, because this was a matter of course. He had the battle prowess of an elite sword venerable, while Huang Tian was an advanced sword venerable. There was a huge gap between the two of them. Moreover, Chu Mu's mastery of illusion and reality was very profound, so Huang Tian couldn't distinguish between the real and the fake. His battle talent was also greater than Huang Tian's, and the instantaneous sword technique domain power affected Huang Tian's reaction speed. Defeat was inevitable. Time passed slowly. 2 sword venerables entered the 10,000 battle platform. One won and advanced, while the other lost and was eliminated. There were a total of 5,000 battles in the first round. Each battle lasted for only 3 breaths, and some took close to 15 minutes to decide the winner. This would take a lot of time. However, to the sword venerables, they didn't seem to feel the flow of time. They tried their best to observe every battle because every victorious sword venerable could become their opponent in the next round. As for the defeated sword venerables, they treated themselves as spectators. While watching, they imagined how they should react, dodge, and even counterattack to turn the situation around. The Sword Saint of the 10,000 Battles Palace stood at the side and watched expressionlessly with his hands behind his back. Occasionally, a glimmer of light would flash across his eyes. The 5,000 battles had ended. The top 10 sword venerables had displayed their astonishing strength. Their opponents were all at the peak of the sword venerable's realm, but they had been defeated with just one sword strike. In such a battle of different levels, it was difficult to see the true strength of these powerful sword venerables. Only when they encountered opponents with similar battle prowess would they erupt with their true strength. After the first round of battles ended, the sword venerables were all in peak condition. Then, the second round of battles began. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:16. In the first round of the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Gathering, 5,000 advanced and 5,000 were eliminated. Without any rest, the second round began. Who could win in the end and obtain the glory of unparalleled battle prowess? Kill! In the 10,000 battle platform, the two sword venerables faced each other head-on. They attacked with their swords. Dazzling sword light streaked across the sky. The light was boundless, and the power was boundless. The stronger a swordsman was, the higher his realm, and the more he paid attention to the control of power and timing during battle. The sword skills collided and exploded. Countless ripples spread out in all directions. The two figures were like ghosts as they shuttled between the ripples and approached each other. The sword light was like the moonlight in autumn. Beams of light crossed in the air and collided with each other, causing sparks to fly. They intertwined and turned around to slash. Their sword skills were shocking. The two sword venerables were about the same in strength. They both used their true strength to defeat each other. Even if they knew that they had no fate with the glory of unparalleled battle prowess, they still wanted to defeat their opponents one by one. They wanted to see how far they could go and not leave any regret. After an intense battle, one of the sword venerables showed an opening. The other sword venerable was impatient and took advantage of this opening to attack with all his strength. However, his opponent dodged the attack and immediately fell into a disadvantage. After losing an arm, it was hard for the sword venerable to recover in a short time. He was completely at a disadvantage and barely dodged 3 sword attacks before being killed by his opponent. 10 breaths later, 2 more sword venerables entered the 10,000 battle platform. Battle after battle, Qinbuer and Shangguan Qinin were slightly better than Huangfu Huangtian. In the first round, they met opponents who were slightly weaker than them. However, in the second round, they met opponents who were stronger than them. After a difficult battle, they were defeated in the end and had no chance to enter the third round. Among the swordsmen from the Great Kuan Sword Mansion, apart from Chu Mu, the other 3 had already been eliminated. However, the 3 of them had already surpassed many sword venerables to enter the Unparalleled Sword Venerable Gathering. There were hundreds of thousands of sword venerables participating this time, but there were definitely more sword venerables in the ancient sword continent. No one knew how many sword venerables did not come and for what reason. Other than that, Zhu Wudao, Yan Zhiyo, Gu Jianghe, and Zhong Qingtian had defeated their opponents and advanced to the third round. Their strength was between high-level Grand Sword Master and Pinnacle Grand Sword Master. Chu Mu carefully observed every battle. He did not look down on his opponents just because they were weaker than him. Instead, he put himself in their shoes and taught himself how to dodge, how to counterattack, and how to kill his opponents in the most efficient way. All of a sudden, Chu Mu's seat lit up and shot towards Chu Mu. As if time and space had changed, Chu Mu appeared on the myriad battle stage. Chu Mu, I admire your swordsmanship very much. You deserve to be called unparalleled in swordsmanship. Chu Mu's opponent was none other than Tao Feng. Tao Feng's countenance turned serious as he spoke to Chu Mu. However, in this battle, what we rely on now is not sword techniques, but strength. In terms of true strength, you are not my opponent. Your path ends here. How do you know who will win before we fight? Chu Mu indifferently replied. Is that so? I will use my strength to make you understand that sword techniques are only a small part of one's strength. A true swordsman does not rely on sword techniques to become strong. Tao Feng coldly smiled. He had the strength of a pinnacle grand sword master. Although he could not be compared to those pinnacle grand sword masters, he was still considered a powerful existence among the pinnacle grand sword masters. He was confident that he could defeat Chu Mu. Chu Mu is in danger. Seems like he can only stop here. According to the information obtained by the Grand Sword Masters, Chu Mu's strength was between high-level Grand Sword Master and Pinnacle Grand Sword Master. Compared to Tao Feng, who was a veteran Pinnacle Grand Sword Master, the gap was extremely obvious. It was almost certain that Chu Mu would lose. The question now was how long could Chu Mu last under Tao Fang's sword? Then, I will show you the true power of sword technique, Chu Mu indifferently said. As soon as his voice fell, everyone only saw Chu Mu take a step forward. In a trance, he left a shadow on the spot. It looked like he was about to charge forward or retreat, but in fact, Chu Mu's shadow appeared in front of Tao Fang. I have already seen you use this footwork in the first round, Tao Fang coldly said. He lightly tapped the ground with the tip of his foot and flew back as if he was weightless. He unsheathed his sword and flicked it upwards. The sword radiance was like a ball of purple flame that rushed towards Chu Mu. With a pop, Chu Mu's shadow shattered, but his real body strangely appeared beside Tao Fang. It was like a dream, like an illusion, but real at the same time. He stood firmly with one foot in front and the other behind, as if he had taken root on the ground. The center of his body sank down, and his right hand held the hilt of his sword. A peerless sword radiance burst out from within. Tao Fang suddenly had a creepy feeling. A chill ran from the soles of his feet to his spine, and his pores exploded. The endless sword radiance made his body feel like it was being torn apart. The sword had not been unsheathed, but he had already smelled the scent of death. Without hesitation, Tao Fang exerted all his strength. His sword origin was like thunder and lightning, and with a boom, he quickly rushed to one side. At the same time, he unsheathed his sword. An arc of light was like an aurora that cut through the void. It was extremely cold and could cut through everything. Unsheathing the sword was also a kind of attack. The cold sword light almost froze the air. When it passed by, Tao Fang only felt that his protective sword essence was useless. The cold sword radiance penetrated into his body, almost freezing half of his body. Fortunately, he was strong enough to react in time. The difference was only 1/1000th of a second, so he was not cut by Chu Mu's sword. Otherwise, he would have been cut in half. He did not use any sword techniques, but only unsheathing the sword. Unsheathing the sword was also an action in the basic swordsmanship. How terrifying! The sword venerables looked at Chu Mu seriously. That sword had left a deep impression on them. For the first time, they understood that the power of swordsmanship could be so terrifying in a battle where one used all their strength. This Chu Mu's swordsmanship has actually reached such a level. It's too terrifying. That sword just now was not inferior to the power of an ordinary sword technique. Could it be that this person was born for swordsmanship? This kind of swordsmanship is close to a divine technique. The sword saints' divine wills collided and discussed in the Wan Battle Palace. They were all amazed. After his sword missed, Chu Mu's figure moved again. He merged the illusionary profound into the flying swan illusory steps and pushed it to the limit. He was like a ghost that appeared and disappeared. It was hard to tell what was real and what was fake. Like a maggot, Chu Mu followed closely behind Tao Fang. Tao Fang constantly wanted to increase the distance between them and use powerful sword techniques to kill Chu Mu. Unfortunately, Chu Mu was like his shadow. He kept getting closer and closer to him. His sword was untraceable, making Tao Fang exhausted. Damn it! Why is he so difficult to deal with? Tao Fang's face was extremely ugly. He could not imagine that he would be forced to such an extent by Chu Mu's swordsmanship. Although he used sword origin and sword intent, the essence was still swordsmanship and not sword technique. I have to find a suitable time to get rid of Chu Mu. Tao Fang's mind was spinning rapidly as he thought of various ways. It seems that I can only use my swordsmanship to clash with him and find the best time to increase the distance. As long as I increase the distance, I can use a powerful sword technique to kill him. Tao Fang thought to himself as he made this decision. He was also very clear that this was a very risky decision because Chu Mu's swordsmanship was too strong. Recalling the scene where he was instantly killed by Chu Mu in a pure swordsmanship battle, his heart could not help but tremble. However, if he did not find a chance to increase the distance between them, he could only dodge pathetically and lose in the end. The sword venerables were shocked when they saw Tao Fong dodging in a sorry state. It was hard to imagine that a veteran top sword venerable would be chased so pathetically by an opponent who was not as strong as him. Is Chu Mu's strength really not at the level of a top sword venerable? It should be said that this guy's strength is between a high-level sword venerable and a top sword venerable. However, he should be most proficient in close combat. He should be able to display his swordsmanship to the fullest extent. In this state, he should be at the level of a top sword venerable. Tao Fong had already adjusted himself. He dodged and counterattacked with a sword. This sword was like a fleeting glimpse, extremely fast. It was the fastest sword he could perform right now. He didn't aim to kill Chu Mu. He only wanted to force Chu Mu back for a split second and gain a sliver of time to open up the distance. It was a dazzling and brilliant sword. The sword light was so dazzling that no one dared to look directly at it. Many sword venerables were sure that if they were in Chu Mu's position, they might not be able to withstand this sword. They would have to retreat. Once they retreated, Tao Fong would seize the opportunity to increase the distance between them. Everyone stared at Chu Mu with their eyes wide open. How would he deal with this? Little did they know that in their eyes, the incomparably fast and dazzling sword was only not bad in Chu Mu's eyes, nothing more. Without dodging, retreating, or blocking, Chu Mu swung his sword, as if it was part of nature. The power of the sword art domain was activated. The space within a 1-meter radius of the sword was immediately affected and distorted. The traction force caused Tao Fong's sword to move uncontrollably to the side. Tao Fong felt a strange force pulling his sword to the side uncontrollably. This made his expression change drastically. This sword was the most crucial one. Could only succeed and not fail. But now it was going to fail. Even if he was unwilling, Tao Fong could not reverse the situation. In the eyes of others, Tao Fong's dazzling sword was moving to the side in a strange manner. It was as if Tao Fong was deliberately going easy on Yi Shiwen. Would Tao Fong go easy on Yi Shiwen? The answer was no. Then, the reason why the sword had deviated was completely due to Chu Mu's counterattack. It was a sword that caused one's hair to stand on end. The deviation of the sword meant that Tao Fong had lost his chance. There was no chance for Tao Fong to make a comeback. The sword light was like a cold star blooming in front of Tao Fong. Then, Tao Fong felt an intense pain between his eyebrows. It instantly spread to his entire head. It was as if his head was about to split open. His consciousness fell into darkness. Tao Fong was dead. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:17. The battle between Chu Mu and Tao Fong ended with Chu Mu's overwhelming victory, leaving countless people in shock. Chu Mu demonstrated the power of sword techniques to the sword venerables. It turned out that one could be so powerful without using sword techniques, defeating the strong as the weak and killing the strong. However, after thinking about it carefully, the sword venerables felt that they couldn't do what Chu Mu did. That kind of sword technique was unfathomable, and only that kind of sword technique could reach such a level. Of course, the sword venerables were shocked, but they wouldn't change their path. They were very clear and firm about their path, so they wouldn't change it easily. Moreover, the path of sword techniques wasn't that easy to walk. Chu Mu stood calmly in his seat, not saying a word. He was recalling the battle just now in his mind. He wanted to see if he could have done it more perfectly as a spectator. As for Tao Fong, he had an ugly expression and was somewhat dejected. In terms of sword techniques, he was defeated by Chu Mu in a single strike. Now, in terms of overall strength, he was still defeated by Chu Mu. Was it because he didn't have a chance to show his true strength? Excuses, those were all excuses. The real reason was that he wasn't strong enough. If he was strong enough, he would naturally be able to deal with Chu Mu's attacks. He would naturally be able to pull away from Chu Mu and kill Chu Mu with his sword technique. There were no ifs. If he wasn't strong enough, he would only be defeated. If he had the strength of a peak sword venerable, perhaps he could contend with an ultimate sword venerable. The sword venerable's divine wills collided and discussed. So far, Chu Mu hadn't shown the strength of a peak sword venerable in 2 battles. The sword venerables weren't strong enough to see through Chu Mu's true strength with a single glance. The shock gradually died down and the battles continued. There were 5,000 people in the second round, so there were a total of 2,500 battles. After that, the third round began immediately. The first battle of the third round ushered in a climax, because the 2 sword venerables in this battle both had the strength of an ultimate sword venerable. It could be said that this battle was the first clash between ultimate sword venerables. Just how strong is the ultimate sword lord? Let me see for myself. Chu Mu muttered to himself as a glint flashed across his eyes. These 2 sword venerables knew each other and seemed to have had some conflicts in the past. After they mocked each other for a while, they drew their swords and attacked with all their might. The swordsmen of the ancient sword continent all had the same fighting style. When they didn't have any sword skills, they would often use all sorts of sword techniques to fight. For example, when Chu Mu was still in the sword chi realm, he would use the breeze swordsmanship and other sword technique. Only when the time was right would he use the ultimate sword moves of his sword technique. When the swordsmen gradually became stronger and those sword techniques were no longer suitable, they would abandon those sword techniques and focus on sword technique. When they were in close combat, they would use sword techniques as support. The moment the 2 sword sovereigns attacked, Chu Mu's heart shook. Their sword techniques were very powerful. Chu Mu shot towards himself to replace one of them, but he was unable to resist the might of the sword techniques. He has comprehended at least 90% sword intent. Chu Mu muttered to himself. He was still shaken. 90% sword intent was much stronger than Chu Mu's current sword intent. Adding on the profound, his comprehension was much deeper than Chu Mu's. The combined might of these 2 sword techniques was even more terrifying. Of course, if it were Chu Mu, he wouldn't be so foolish as to take it head-on. When the sword came out, the sword technique roared. The sword light tore through the air, unstoppable. The collision of sword techniques turned into surging energy waves that wreaked havoc in all directions. The myriad battle platforms' seal flickered with all sorts of lights as the energy waves dispersed. It was as if the sea was roaring, the heavenly river was upside down, and the stars were chasing after the moon. Kill! Die! The 2 sword sovereigns roared. After using their sword techniques, they approached each other. Their swords collided with boundless momentum and stabbed out at tricky angles. Sparks flew as an ear-piercing sound reverberated. The sound waves wreaked havoc. As the sword techniques collided, they looked for an opportunity to use their sword technique. There were strong and weak sword skills, and there were also close-range and long-range attack. Weak sword skills were not necessarily useless. The key was to grasp the timing and use the environment. Only a suitable sword skill would be able to unleash the strongest power. These 2 sword sovereigns had rich battle experience and deeply understood the timing. Therefore, they used their sword techniques when they were close to each other. Occasionally, they would use weak but fast sword techniques to attack each other. They wanted to make each other reveal flaws. Their strength and experience were equal. The battle was intense. The sword sovereigns in the seats outside the myriad battle platform were immersed in the battle. 15 minutes passed, and the battle between the 2 ultimate sword sovereigns continued. Under such circumstances, the battle would probably end in a draw. However, on the myriad battle platform, only life and death could be determined. In the end, one sword sovereign was severely injured and the other died. The second battle was between Lai Mountain Sword Sovereign, Lai Mountain Tiger, and the other ultimate sword sovereign. Lai Mountain Tiger was recognized as one of the top 10 sword sovereigns. However, until now, he hadn't displayed his true strength. Therefore, no one knew how strong he was. Lai Mountain Tiger, I will use my strength to tell you that you are not one of the top 10 sword sovereigns. Lai Mountain Tiger's opponent, the ultimate sword sovereign, said. As an ultimate sword sovereign, it was inevitable that he would be dissatisfied and jealous if he wasn't listed as one of the top 10 sword sovereigns. Make your move. Lai Mountain Tiger's gaze was as if he was looking at a jumping clown. Su Haosha and the others smiled. Within their smiles, there was a trace of disdain. The top 10 sword sovereigns were recognized, and only they knew how strong they were. Among all the sword sovereigns present, only they could compete with the other top 10 sword sovereigns. There might be exceptions, but they were very rare. Heavenly Dragon Slash! The sword sovereign was furious. He felt that he was being looked down upon. Under his anger, he used his sword. The roar of a dragon was heard as the sword slashed down. Vaguely, it was as if a flood dragon broke through the sky, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. With a domineering attitude, it rushed towards Lai Mountain Tiger. Lai Mountain Tiger didn't move an inch, allowing the flood dragon to rush towards him. A faint smile hung on the corner of his mouth. The power is not bad, but it's still too weak. As his voice fell, the flood dragon was already halfway through. In the blink of an eye, it would hit Lai Mountain Tiger. First move, Tiger swallows the dragon. Lai Mountain Tiger's voice was like a tiger roaring in the forest. He slashed out with his sword. In an instant, a ferocious tiger jumped out from the void and rushed towards the flood dragon in the air. It opened its mouth and swallowed the flood dragon into its stomach. The ferocious tiger expanded in the air and became even bigger and more ferocious. It fell from the sky and clawed at the sword sovereign. The sword sovereign was stunned. He had never seen his sword technique being defeated like this. It was actually swallowed. What was going on? As the ferocious tiger fell, its claws tore the sword sovereign's body apart. Blood splattered everywhere as the sword sovereign turned into white light and disappeared. After the ferocious tiger landed, it let out a roar. The fur on its body opened up. It was very lifelike, as if it was a real tiger from ancient times. After 3 breaths, the ferocious tiger collapsed. It was formed by Lai Mountain Tiger's sword energy, sword intent, and profound power. It was not a real tiger with flesh and blood. So powerful. He is also an ultimate sword sovereign, but he defeated his opponent so easily. This Lai Mountain Tiger is indeed one of the top 10 sword sovereigns. His strength is so terrifying. I don't have any confidence in winning against him. One of the ultimate sword sovereigns exclaimed. Chu Mu's pupils shrank rapidly. He was shocked by the tip of the iceberg of strength that Lai Mountain Tiger had shown. With his eyesight, he could often see a lot of information from the details. For example, the move, Tiger Swallows the Dragon, used by Lai Mountain Tiger just now was not a sword technique. The reason why Lai Mountain Tiger called it, Tiger Swallows the Dragon, was probably just a bad joke. The reason was that his opponent's sword technique was called the Sky Dragon Slash, and it had even formed a flood dragon to attack Lai Mountain Tiger. Although it was not a sword technique, it was more powerful than many sword techniques. From this point, it could be seen that Lai Mountain Tiger's control of his own strength had reached a level that ordinary sword sovereigns could not reach. He could control it as he wished. Of course, this kind of sword technique could not be compared to the sword techniques that he had mastered. Those were the sword techniques that had been tempered over and over again. They were the truly powerful sword technique. How could Chu Mu not be shocked by the strength of a sword technique that he had mastered on the spot to defeat his opponent's sword technique? If it was an ordinary ultimate sword sovereign, with my current strength, I might be able to fight him. But if it is an ultimate sword sovereign like Lai Mountain Tiger, I am still far from being able to defeat him. Chu Mu thought to himself and let out a breath. Even he himself wasn't sure how many strikes he could take if he were to face an ultimate sword venerable like Lai Shan Hu. 1 strike? 2 strikes? or 3 strikes. Without a fight, it was unknown. The only thing that he could be sure of was that he was absolutely no match for an ultimate sword sovereign like Lai Mountain Tiger, even if he used all of his strength. Thinking of this, Chu Mu did not feel frustrated. Instead, a fighting spirit grew in his heart, like a seed that was about to take root and germinate. First place. Of course, it was gratifying to be the first place, but after that, one would often lose their goal and need to find a new one. Now, Chu Mu knew that he could not be the first place, because there were at least 5 sword sovereigns who were stronger than him. Therefore, within a certain period of time, he only needed to surpass them. As for what would happen after that, it was a matter for the future. There was no need to think about it now. But before that, I need to fight with one of the top 10 sword sovereigns. Only then can I know how big the gap is between me and them. Chu Mu clenched his fists and said to himself with a determined look. He only hoped that in the following battles, he could meet one of the top 10 sword sovereigns. Even if he had to stop in the 3rd round, it did not matter. However, Chu Mu's wish was destined to fail. In the 3rd round, there were a total of 2,500 sword sovereigns fighting. When it was Chu Mu's turn, his opponent was also an ultimate sword sovereign. Compared to Tao Feng, this ultimate sword sovereign was slightly weaker. What was more unfortunate was that this ultimate sword sovereign was good at close combat. If he encountered Chu Mu, his defeat was inevitable. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.